Meritocratic eugenics. What if we required people to earn the right to have children? What if, instead of treating reproduction as a universal human right, we viewed it as a privilege to be granted only to those who demonstrate fitness for parenthood? This is the controversial premise of meritocratic eugenics, a philosophical position arguing that reproduction should be regulated based on the merit, capability, and genetic qualities of potential parents. In virtually every area of life, from driving cars to performing surgery, society requires demonstration of competence before granting privileges, argues philosopher Hugh LaFollette, who proposed a licensing scheme for parents. Yet when it comes to creating and shaping new human lives, arguably our most consequential activity, we impose no standards whatsoever. Though LaFollette himself rejects genetic criteria, his licensing argument opens the door to the more controversial meritocratic eugenic position that reproduction should be regulated not just for child welfare, but for societal improvement. This philosophy combines elements of traditional eugenics with modern meritocratic values, arguing that reproductive rights should be earned through demonstrating desirable traits, whether genetic, intellectual, financial, or moral. The historical shadow of eugenics looms large over any such proposal. Early 20th century eugenic programs involved forced sterilization of the unfit, immigration restrictions based on national origin, and ultimately, in Nazi Germany, genocide. These atrocities have made eugenics perhaps the most discredited philosophy of the modern era, associated with scientific racism, ableism, and authoritarian control over human bodies. Proponents of meritocratic eugenics attempt to distance themselves from this history. They argue for non-coercive incentive systems rather than forced sterilization, for criteria based on individual merit rather than race or class, and for universal application rather than targeting marginalized groups. They frame their position not as oppression, but as rational management of humanity's genetic future and protection of children's interests. Every child deserves competent parents, writes philosopher Julian Savulescu. If we can predict with reasonable accuracy which potential parents are likely to abuse, neglect, or otherwise harm their children, preventing these pregnancies represents a moral imperative, not to improve the gene pool, but to prevent suffering. This child welfare argument represents the more moderate position. More controversial are proposals explicitly aimed at improving population genetics. Some philosophers argue that society has legitimate interests in the genetic qualities of future generations, just as it has interests in environmental preservation for those generations. If certain genetic conditions create substantial suffering or social costs, might society justifiably discourage their transmission? Singapore's former Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew implemented limited eugenic policies based on this reasoning. His government provided financial incentives for educated women to have more children while offering sterilization incentives to less educated women. The quality of a nation's population is as important as its sovereignty, Lee argued. We must encourage those who earn less than $1,500 per month not to procreate. Such programs highlight the fundamental tension in meritocratic eugenics, the conflict between reproductive freedom and collective interests. Most human rights frameworks consider reproduction a fundamental right that cannot be contingent on merit, capability, or social contribution. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights explicitly states that men and women of full age have the right to marry and to found a family. Making this right contingent on government approval, regardless of the criteria, strikes many as an unacceptable violation of human autonomy. Critics argue that meritocratic eugenics inevitably discriminates against marginalized groups regardless of its stated neutrality. If reproduction requires proving financial stability, education, or passing tests designed by dominant groups, these requirements will disproportionately exclude the poor, minorities, and people with disabilities. The philosophy's meritocratic veneer, they suggest, simply disguises the same discriminatory patterns that characterized historical eugenics. The idea that some people deserve to reproduce while others don't is fundamentally incompatible with human equality. argues disability rights activist Rebecca Cockley. It inevitably creates a hierarchy of human value based on characteristics deemed desirable by those in power. Bioethicists raise additional concerns about implementation. Who determines the criteria for reproductive fitness? What traits are considered desirable or undesirable? How would such policies be enforced without draconian violations of bodily autonomy? Would underground reproduction flourish, creating a new class of illegal children? These practical questions highlight how quickly meritocratic principles could devolve into authoritarian control. Religious perspectives generally reject meritocratic eugenics as usurping divine authority over human creation. Many traditions view children as gifts rather than projects, and reproduction as a natural right beyond government jurisdiction. From these perspectives, human attempts to control which lives come into existence represent dangerous hubris, regardless of the stated intentions. The philosophical debate extends beyond practical concerns to fundamental questions about human value. Meritocratic eugenics implicitly suggests that some potential lives are more worthy of existence than others based on genetic qualities or the capabilities of potential parents. This perspective challenges the notion of inherent human dignity independent of ability, achievement, or social contribution. Defenders respond that we already make similar judgments in other contexts. Adoption agencies evaluate parental fitness before placing children. Reproductive technology access is often limited by financial means. Immigration policies select for desirable qualities in potential citizens. If we accept these practices, why view reproductive regulation as fundamentally different? We already practice passive eugenics through prenatal testing and selective abortion, notes bioethicist Peter Singer controversially. The question isn't whether we should make reproductive selections, but on what basis and through what mechanisms. The debate becomes increasingly complex when considering genetic technologies. As genetic screening, embryo selection, and potentially gene editing advance, individual reproductive choices could collectively reshape human genetics without explicit government policies. Meritocratic eugenics might emerge not through centralized control, but through accumulated individual decisions within market frameworks, with access determined by wealth rather than government-assessed merit. This market-based scenario raises concerns about inequality. If genetic enhancement becomes available but expensive, could we see genetic divergence between economic classes? Would the wealthy become a genetic elite with enhanced capabilities while others remain limited to natural genetic lottery outcomes? Some argue that preventing such divergence might require either restricting these technologies entirely or ensuring universal access through public funding. Though few openly advocate meritocratic eugenics today, elements of its reasoning appear in debates about parental licensing, genetic screening, and population policy. China's former one-child policy, though motivated primarily by population control rather than eugenics, demonstrated how reproductive regulation can become a tool of social engineering with profound consequences for human rights and demographic patterns. What makes this philosophy particularly controversial is how it challenges our fundamental assumptions about reproduction as a natural right. Most political frameworks, from liberalism to socialism, assume that reproduction belongs to the domain of personal choice rather than public policy. Meritocratic eugenics suggests instead that creating new humans is a social act with social consequences, appropriately subject to social governance. The question at its core, should everyone have the equal right to reproduce regardless of their capabilities or characteristics, forces us to examine tensions between individual freedom, child welfare, social costs, and genetic futures. While history provides overwhelming evidence of eugenics' potential for abuse, the philosophical questions about reproductive responsibility and the interests of future generations remain unresolved. Transhumanism. Death is coming for you. Your body is already failing. Cells are accumulating damage, muscles weakening, cognitive abilities declining. Eventually, your heart will stop. Your brain will die. Everything you are, memories, experiences, consciousness, will vanish. Unless, what if death is just a technical problem waiting for a solution? What if aging is a disease that can be cured? What if your consciousness could transfer to a more durable substrate than fragile flesh? What if being human is just the beginning? These aren't science fiction questions anymore. They're the central promises of transhumanism, a controversial philosophy that advocates using technology to fundamentally transform the human condition, transcending our biological limitations through genetic engineering, nanotechnology, artificial intelligence, and mind uploading. The future belongs to those who believe in the beauty of their post-human dreams, proclaims transhumanist author Natasha Vita-More, echoing Roosevelt, but pushing far beyond his human-centered vision. Silicon Valley billionaires are already pouring millions into life extension research. CRISPR technology allows precise genetic modifications. Brain-computer interfaces advance yearly. Artificial intelligence surpasses human capabilities in domain after domain. And transhumanists aren't just watching these developments with interest. They're actively working to accelerate them, believing technological enhancement of human capabilities isn't just possible, but morally imperative. Oxford philosopher Nick Bostrom argues that failing to pursue enhancement technologies would constitute a crime against humanity by condemning future generations to preventable suffering and death. But what happens when we succeed? When we can edit genomes to eliminate disease, augment intelligence, and enhance physical capabilities? When neural implants enable direct brain-to-internet connection? When consciousness can be uploaded, copied, or merged with artificial intelligence? We are the last generation of pure humans and the first generation of transhumans, declares transhumanist philosopher Max Moore. We are the early adopters, the adventurous ones, exploring the boundaries of human capability and blazing the trail that others will follow. Critics from across the political spectrum find this vision not just misguided, but deeply threatening. Religious conservatives see it as playing God, violating natural or divine order. Leftist critics warn of deepening inequality as enhancements become available only to elites. Environmentalists fear accelerated resource consumption. Bioethicists worry about unforeseen consequences of redesigning humanity. Transhumanism is the ultimate form of narcissism and escapism, argues political theorist Francis Fukuyama, who labeled transhumanism the world's most dangerous idea in a famous 2004 essay. Instead of confronting human social problems, transhumanists seek to transcend the human condition altogether. To understand the controversy, we must recognize that transhumanism isn't just a set of technological predictions, but a comprehensive philosophical worldview, one that challenges our most fundamental assumptions about what it means to be human. Unlike religious transhumanists who seek to fulfill divine potential through technology, mainstream transhumanism emerges from secular humanist roots, but pushes far beyond them. Traditional humanism celebrates human dignity, reason, and autonomy, while accepting biological limits. Transhumanism retains these values, but rejects biological constraints as unnecessary suffering to be overcome. Mother Nature is a mad scientist, says transhumanist philosopher David Pearce, creator of the hedonistic imperative, which advocates using biotechnology to eliminate suffering from the biosphere. She's created a world in which suffering is endemic, animals eat each other alive, billions of sentient beings endure lives dominated by misery. We have a moral obligation to intervene. This technological imperative creates strange political alignments. Libertarian transhumanists like Peter Thiel advocate minimal regulation of enhancement technologies, believing individuals should be free to modify their bodies and minds however they choose. Democratic transhumanists like James Hughes argue for equal access to enhancements to prevent a genetic divide between enhanced elites and natural humans. The unifying principle is morphological freedom, the right to modify one's body, brain, and consciousness using technology. But as bioethicist Leon Kass asks, in a world increasingly without givens, how shall we know what to choose? When all is permitted and nothing is forbidden, on what basis shall we decide what to do or not to do? Consider three scenarios that illuminate transhumanism's most controversial elements. Scenario 1. Cognitive enhancement. Your colleague takes a new FDA-approved neural implant that increases working memory by 40% and processing speed by 60%. Suddenly, she's dramatically outperforming you at work. The implant costs $200,000 and isn't covered by insurance. What happens to those who can't afford enhancement? Will natural humans become an underclass in a world of enhanced competitors? Scenario 2. Radical life extension. A breakthrough therapy allows the wealthy to extend their lifespan indefinitely, maintaining the physical condition of a healthy 30-year-old. Political power, capital, and property remain concentrated in the hands of an immortal elite who have little incentive to address long-term problems like climate change they can simply outlive. Gerontocracy becomes permanent. Scenario 3. Mind uploading. Consciousness can be digitized and transferred to advanced computer systems, where it can be backed up, copied, or run at accelerated speeds. Digital minds experience subjective centuries in days, evolving intellectually at rates incomprehensible to biological humans. What rights do digital copies have? What happens when posthuman intelligence evolves beyond human understanding? Transhumanists don't deny these risks but argue they can be managed through careful governance. Hughes proposes a democratic transhumanism that ensures enhancement technologies are universally accessible and regulated for safety. Anders Sandberg suggests tax-funded universal basic enhancement to prevent genetic stratification. Bostrom advocates differential technological development, accelerating beneficial technologies while delaying potentially dangerous ones. Critics remain unconvinced. Bioconservative thinker Michael Sandel argues that genetic enhancement threatens our appreciation for the giftedness of life and undermines solidarity by suggesting some lives are more valuable than others. Environmentalist Bill McKibben warns that enhancement technologies will accelerate resource consumption beyond sustainable limits. Disability rights advocates fear a world where difference is increasingly pathologized. Perhaps most fundamentally, critics question whether transcending biological humanity means losing something essential about ourselves. As technology critic Jaron Lanier asks, what if the cost of machines that think is people who don't? The transhumanist response is uncompromising. We are not defined by our limitations, but by our capacity to transcend them. Consciousness, creativity, and connection matter, not the substrate they run on. If these can be enhanced, expanded, or transferred to more durable platforms, that represents not the end of humanity, but its evolution. The human story isn't ending, but transforming into something potentially far greater. Why stay at the infant stage when we can grow up? Asks transhumanist philosopher Natasha Vita-Moore. The future of humanity should be greater than our past. This radical vision places transhumanism at odds with virtually every traditional worldview. Religious traditions generally see human nature as given, with inherent purpose and meaning. Political philosophies from conservatism to socialism typically assume humanity as a constant, even as they disagree about social arrangements. Environmental ethics often valorizes the natural over the artificial. Transhumanism rejects these premises. Human nature isn't fixed but fluid, not an endpoint but a work in progress. Death isn't meaningful but meaningless. The natural isn't inherently good, it's often brutal, wasteful, and indifferent to suffering. Technology isn't just for solving practical problems, but for transforming what we are. The most dangerous thought you can have as a creative person is to think you know what you're doing, says transhumanist pioneer Ray Kurzweil. Creativity is the antithesis of planning. This philosophy, combining scientific optimism with ontological radicalism, has gained traction particularly in technology and finance circles. Google funds life extension research through Calico. Elon Musk's Neuralink develops brain-computer interfaces. OpenAI works toward artificial general intelligence. These aren't fringe efforts, but mainstream corporate initiatives backed by billions. As you watch this video, research continues on CRISPR gene editing, neural interfaces, longevity treatments, and artificial intelligence. The transhumanist future isn't arriving in some distant tomorrow. It's emerging now, decision by decision, invention by invention, modification by modification. The question isn't whether humanity will transform, it's whether we'll shape that transformation consciously, equitably, and wisely, or stumble into it driven by profit motives, military applications, and individual enhancement without considering collective consequences. Negative utilitarianism. If you could press a button that would painlessly eliminate all life on Earth, would doing so be morally right? Most ethical frameworks would consider this the ultimate wrong, the extinction of all conscious beings, the end of all potential value and meaning. But one controversial philosophical position might not only permit it, but require it: negative utilitarianism. The total amount of suffering per year in the natural world is beyond all decent contemplation, writes philosopher David Pearce. During the minute it takes me to compose this sentence, thousands of animals are being eaten alive. Others are running for their lives, whimpering with fear. Others are being slowly devoured from within by rasping parasites. Thousands of all kinds are dying of starvation, thirst, and disease. This observation forms the emotional core of negative utilitarianism, a radical variant of utilitarian ethics that prioritizes the reduction of suffering over the increase of happiness. While classical utilitarianism seeks to maximize overall well-being, balancing pleasure against pain, negative utilitarianism focuses almost exclusively on minimizing suffering, viewing the alleviation of pain as morally more urgent than the creation of pleasure. The philosophy traces back to Karl Popper, who first outlined it in 1945 as a response to totalitarian regimes that justified present suffering in pursuit of future utopias. Instead of the greatest happiness for the greatest number, one should demand more modestly the least amount of avoidable suffering for all, Popper wrote. He intended this as a practical political principle, not a comprehensive moral theory. However, later philosophers developed more radical versions. The strongest form, pure negative utilitarianism, holds that reducing suffering is the only moral goal that matters. More moderate versions assign priority to suffering reduction while still valuing happiness promotion. What unites all variants is the asymmetrical moral weight placed on suffering versus happiness. For the negative utilitarian, a world of extreme suffering that contains small amounts of happiness is not redeemed by that happiness, explains philosopher Toby Ord. But a world of extreme happiness that contains small amounts of suffering is fundamentally marred by that suffering. This asymmetry has intuitive appeal. Most people agree that preventing torture seems more morally urgent than providing ice cream, even lots of ice cream. If forced to choose between preventing extreme suffering for one person or creating ecstatic pleasure for many, most would prioritize preventing the suffering. Negative utilitarianism systematizes this intuition and applies it universally. The philosophy becomes truly controversial when following its logic to the extreme. If suffering prevention is the primary or only moral goal, and if life inevitably contains suffering, then preventing life itself could become the ultimate moral imperative. This leads to what philosopher Derek Parfit called the ridiculous conclusion, that the complete extinction of all life might be morally required, since only non-existence guarantees zero suffering. Philosopher David Benatar, though not explicitly a negative utilitarian, makes a related argument in his Asymmetry between pleasure and pain. The absence of pain is good, even if that good is not enjoyed by anyone, whereas the absence of pleasure is not bad unless there is somebody for whom this absence is a deprivation. By this reasoning, non-existence is preferable to existence from a moral perspective. These conclusions seem deeply counterintuitive to most people. Surely a universe containing the occasional suffering but also love, beauty, achievement, and joy is better than an empty universe of rocks and gas? Yet pure negative utilitarianism struggles to explain why, if suffering reduction is the only moral priority. Negative utilitarianism appears to be the creed of people who are unwilling to make any sacrifice of their own comfort for the happiness of others, but are willing to sacrifice the happiness of others for their own comfort, critiques philosopher R.N. Smart, highlighting how the philosophy can justify preventing others' existence to avoid the risk of their suffering. Beyond the extinction concern, negative utilitarianism faces other objections. It seems to ignore the value of consent and autonomy. If someone willingly accepts suffering for a greater goal, like an athlete enduring painful training, the philosophy might still consider that suffering fundamentally unjustified if it could be prevented. Critics also argue that negative utilitarianism creates perverse incentives regarding consciousness itself. If only conscious beings can suffer, then preventing or eliminating consciousness becomes a straightforward way to reduce suffering. Taking this logic to its conclusion, transforming the universe into non-conscious matter would optimize the negative utilitarian goal. Despite these troubling implications, more moderate versions of negative utilitarianism continue to influence practical ethics. Prioritizing the alleviation of severe suffering guides many humanitarian efforts, from global health initiatives targeting neglected tropical diseases to animal welfare campaigns against factory farming. Many effective altruists, while not embracing pure negative utilitarianism, give special weight to suffering prevention in their cause prioritization. We should focus resources on helping those who are suffering the most, not because other happiness doesn't matter, but because suffering demands a moral urgency that mere absence of optimal happiness doesn't, argues philosopher and effective altruist William MacAskill, representing a priority version of the philosophy. The debate around negative utilitarianism connects to deeper questions about the asymmetry of pleasure and pain in human experience. Psychologically, negative experiences typically impact us more strongly than positive ones, a phenomenon called negativity bias. Losses hurt more than equivalent gains feel good. Trauma can scar permanently, while moments of joy fade quickly. Is negative utilitarianism simply acknowledging this fundamental asymmetry in conscious experience? Some philosophers have attempted to develop sophisticated variants that retain the intuitive appeal of prioritizing suffering reduction while avoiding the ridiculous conclusion. Threshold negative utilitarianism suggests that once suffering is reduced below a certain level, promoting happiness gains moral importance. Lexical negative utilitarianism holds that certain intense sufferings should never be permitted regardless of potential happiness gains, but that happiness matters once these severe sufferings are eliminated. The philosophy raises particularly difficult questions about wild animal suffering. If the suffering of all sentient beings matters morally, and if nature contains immense suffering through predation, disease, starvation, and parasitism, do we have moral obligations to intervene in natural processes? Some negative utilitarians argue for ecosystem management, or even technological solutions to reduce wild animal suffering, positions that challenge conventional environmental ethics. The ethics of the future will not neglect the interests of non-human animals, suggests philosopher Oscar Horta. A world with less suffering requires us to reconsider our relationship with nature itself. What makes negative utilitarianism so controversial yet important is how it challenges our moral intuitions about the relative importance of reducing harm versus promoting good. It forces us to consider whether our acceptance of suffering, both human and animal, represents a justified compromise or a moral failure. It questions whether creating new lives that will inevitably contain suffering can be justified by the happiness those lives will also contain. In a world still filled with extreme suffering, from torture and war to factory farming and poverty, negative utilitarianism provides a philosophical framework that prioritizes addressing these urgent harms. Whether its more extreme conclusions represent philosophical consistency or reductio ad absurdum remains one of ethics' most provocative debates. Eugenic Transhumanism. What if we could eliminate genetic diseases before birth? What if we could enhance human intelligence, extend lifespan, or improve physical capabilities through genetic selection or modification? And most controversially, what if we had not just the ability, but the moral obligation to direct human evolution? These questions sit at the heart of eugenic transhumanism, perhaps the most controversial intersection in modern bioethics. It combines transhumanism's embrace of technological human enhancement with eugenics' goal of improving human genetic qualities. The result is a philosophy that advocates not just for better technology, but for better humans, genetically engineered to transcend current biological limitations. We are the first species capable of self-directed evolution, declares biologist Julian Savulescu. It would be a moral abdication not to use that power. The term eugenics immediately triggers historical horrors, Nazi sterilization programs, forced breeding policies, and genocide justified through pseudoscientific racism. The eugenic movements of the early 20th century embraced coercive state control over reproduction and targeted vulnerable populations based on deeply flawed understandings of genetics and human worth. Modern eugenic transhumanists distance themselves from this legacy, arguing that contemporary genetics offers precision early eugenicists lacked, while liberal values protect against coercion early eugenicists embraced. They advocate not state-controlled breeding programs, but individual reproductive choice enhanced by genetic technology, what they call liberal eugenics, or newgenics. The philosophy gained prominence when Oxford philosopher Julian Savulescu proposed the principle of procreative beneficence, the idea that parents have a moral obligation to select the child from among the children they could have, who would be expected to have the best life based on available genetic information. This isn't just preventing diseases like Tay-Sachs or cystic fibrosis, but potentially selecting for traits like intelligence, memory, emotional stability, or longevity. If we have the ability to create children with better chances of better lives, Savulescu argues, we should do so. Taken further, eugenic transhumanists like philosopher Nick Bostrom suggest we should not merely select among naturally possible genetic combinations, but actively enhance the human genome beyond its natural capabilities. Why accept the random genetic hand dealt by sexual reproduction when we could engineer superior cognitive abilities, eliminated disease susceptibility, or extended longevity? The possibilities grow more dramatic with each advance in genetic technology. CRISPR gene editing already allows precise modification of embryonic DNA. Iterated embryo selection could potentially increase intelligence far beyond current human ranges. Artificial wombs might eventually remove reproduction from the human body entirely, allowing precise control over developmental environments. Nature's lottery is cruel and inefficient, writes transhumanist philosopher Max Moore. We can do better than random chance. Critics from across the political spectrum find these ideas not just mistaken but dangerous. Religious conservatives argue that human genetic enhancement violates natural or divine order. Progressive critics warn that genetic enhancement technologies would inevitably widen social divides, creating genetic castes based on economic access. Disability rights advocates see eugenic thinking as fundamentally devaluing lives that don't meet arbitrary standards of normal or enhanced. The line between prevention and enhancement, between therapy and eugenics, is impossibly blurry, warns disability theorist Rosemarie Garland Thompson. Who decides which lives are worth living? The prospect of genetic enhancement raises profound questions about human identity and equality. If cognitive enhancement becomes available, would unenhanced humans become a permanent underclass? Would society fracture into genetic castes with radically different capabilities? Would human genetic diversity, a source of cultural richness and evolutionary resilience, be sacrificed for standardized improvements? Beyond practical concerns lie deeper philosophical questions. Does genetic enhancement represent liberation from biological constraints or commodification of human life? Does it expand human potential or undermine what makes us human? Is the random genetic lottery of sexual reproduction truly a problem to solve, or a foundation of human equality worth preserving? When we attempt to control every aspect of human development, argues political theorist Michael Sandel, we lose the appreciation for the gifted quality of human life and risk turning children into products. Eugenic transhumanists respond that uncontrolled genetic inheritance is hardly egalitarian. Some are born with genetic advantages while others suffer debilitating conditions. True equality, they argue, would mean ensuring everyone starts life with similarly advantageous genetic profiles rather than accepting the random inequalities of natural reproduction. The status quo is not neutral, Savulescu contends. Allowing serious genetic diseases when we could prevent them is a choice with moral consequences. Most provocative is the eugenic transhumanist argument that humanity faces existential challenges, from artificial intelligence to climate change, that our evolved psychology is ill-equipped to handle. Our tribal instincts, cognitive biases, and short-term thinking evolved for Stone Age survival, not managing planetary-scale risks. Some argue we must enhance human moral and cognitive capacities to overcome these limitations, that genetic enhancement is not just desirable but necessary for human survival. Critics counter that technological solutions to human moral failures represent dangerous hubris. The same human limitations that create global problems would influence how we design genetic improvements, potentially amplifying our worst tendencies rather than transcending them. Moreover, concentrating such power in the hands of scientific and economic elites creates unprecedented risks of misuse or unintended consequences. The debate creates strange political alignments. Religious conservatives and progressive social justice advocates find themselves allied against enhancement technologies for different reasons. Libertarians who support absolute reproductive freedom may align with transhumanists advocating genetic choice. Environmental thinkers split between those who see human enhancement as ecological hubris and those who see it as necessary for creating sustainable human societies. This controversy isn't merely theoretical. Pre-implantation genetic diagnosis already allows selection among embryos for certain traits. Gene therapy trials for various conditions are underway. Multiple countries have varied regulatory approaches to genetic technologies, creating scenarios where enhancements prohibited in some nations might be available in others. The philosophical questions of eugenic transhumanism increasingly require practical political answers. Whether we support or oppose genetic enhancement technologies, the accelerating pace of genetic science means humanity must engage with these questions. The ability to direct human evolution, to design our descendants rather than accept the genetic lottery, represents an unprecedented power that could redefine what it means to be human. The most profound question eugenic transhumanism forces us to confront is whether humanity, as currently constituted, represents an endpoint worth preserving or a transitional stage in an ongoing evolutionary process we might now consciously direct. The answer will shape not just our future, but potentially the nature of the beings who inhabit it. Cosmicism. What if everything humanity values, our morality, our achievements, our very consciousness, is merely a temporary accident in an indifferent universe? What if the cosmos not only doesn't care about us, but operates according to principles so alien to human understanding that genuine comprehension would shatter our minds? This is Cosmicism, a philosophical perspective emerging from the horror fiction of H.P. Lovecraft that proposes human beings occupy no privileged position in existence, and that the universe is fundamentally indifferent to our concerns, comprehension, and survival. The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents, wrote Lovecraft in his story, The Call of Cthulhu. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. This haunting passage encapsulates Cosmicism's central claim, that human comprehension is severely limited, and that what lies beyond those limits isn't divinely ordered or comprehensible, but utterly alien to our evolved cognitive frameworks. While developed primarily through fiction rather than formal philosophical treatises, Cosmicism has evolved into a genuine philosophical position with adherents who view it as the most honest assessment of humanity's cosmic situation. The philosophy stands in stark opposition to most religious and humanistic traditions, which place human consciousness at the center of cosmic purpose or meaning. Whether through divine creation narratives or secular celebrations of human progress and potential, most philosophical traditions comfort us with the notion that human existence matters. Cosmicism offers no such comfort. It suggests not only that we are cosmically insignificant, a position many secular philosophies acknowledge, but that reality itself operates according to principles fundamentally incompatible with human categories and values. The universe isn't merely indifferent to us, it's incomprehensible to us. Our evolved cognitive frameworks, developed for survival on the African savanna, simply cannot grasp the fundamental nature of cosmic reality. The universe is not only stranger than we imagine, it is stranger than we can imagine, wrote J.B.S. Haldane, expressing a sentiment central to cosmicist thought. This isn't merely the familiar scientific acknowledgement that much remains unknown. It's the more radical claim that much remains unknowable, given the inherent limitations of human cognition. True understanding would require becoming something other than human. What makes cosmicism particularly unsettling is how it challenges both religious and secular narratives of human significance. Religious traditions typically place humans in direct relationship with divine forces that value our existence and moral choices. Humanistic traditions, while often rejecting supernatural frameworks, still celebrate human consciousness as the universe becoming aware of itself, a special development in cosmic evolution. Cosmicism rejects both consolations, suggesting instead that human consciousness is a brief, accidental phenomenon in a cosmos operating according to principles entirely unconcerned with our existence. If I could save the universe by killing one child, I would not do it, because the universe doesn't care, writes philosopher Eugene Thacker in his exploration of cosmicist themes. And someday, the universe will end regardless of what choices we make. This framing directly challenges conventional moral frameworks that assume human actions and choices matter against some larger backdrop of meaning or purpose. The philosophy's most controversial implications concern morality and meaning. If human consciousness is merely a temporary accident in an indifferent cosmos, what grounds do we have for moral judgments? If our species will eventually disappear, leaving no trace, does anything we do truly matter? If the universe operates according to principles fundamentally alien to human comprehension, might our entire moral and conceptual frameworks be nothing but provincial delusions? Critics argue that cosmicism represents a failure of philosophical nerve, an unwillingness to construct meaning in the face of apparent cosmic indifference. Existentialists like Camus and Sartre acknowledge the universe's lack of inherent meaning, but argued this absence creates the freedom and responsibility to construct meaning ourselves. Religious thinkers suggest that cosmic indifference contradicts the evident moral ordering we perceive in existence, which points toward transcendent purpose beyond material explanation. The cosmicist position mistakes the indifference of physical processes for the absence of any meaning whatsoever, argues philosopher Richard Kearney. It fails to distinguish between scientific description of material reality and the phenomenological experience of meaning that emerges from conscious engagement with that reality. Defenders respond that cosmicism doesn't necessarily preclude local, human-scale meaning, but simply places it in proper perspective. We might create significance within our brief existence, while acknowledging that this significance doesn't extend beyond our species or reflect any cosmic purpose. This position resembles philosopher Thomas Nagel's concept of the absurd, the tension between our deep human need for meaning and the universe's failure to provide any. Cosmicism finds unexpected parallels in certain scientific perspectives. Cosmic evolution proceeds through impersonal physical laws without apparent purpose. Evolutionary biology suggests consciousness emerged not to perceive truth, but to enhance survival and reproduction. Cosmology indicates the universe will eventually become uninhabitable for all life. These scientific realities align with cosmicism's vision of human consciousness as temporary and ultimately insignificant in cosmic terms. The increasing recognition of cognitive limitations in fields like psychology and neuroscience also supports cosmicist themes. Our brains evolved for survival in specific environments, not for comprehending quantum mechanics or cosmic inflation. Cognitive science reveals how our perception constructs rather than simply receives reality, suggesting we never encounter the world as it actually is, but only as our brains represent it to us. The human mind evolved to tell us stories about the world that helped our ancestors survive and reproduce, notes cognitive scientist Steven Pinker. It did not evolve to give us an accurate metaphysical understanding of reality. Perhaps most interestingly, cosmicism shares surprising similarities with certain mystical traditions, despite its apparently nihilistic outlook. Both recognize the limitations of ordinary human cognition, in grasping ultimate reality. Both suggest that genuine understanding might require transformation beyond ordinary consciousness. Where they differ is in their characterization of what lies beyond those limits, whether divine intelligence or blind indifferent forces. The philosophy finds contemporary expression in discussions around artificial general intelligence and posthumanism. If we create machine intelligence that operates according to principles utterly alien to human cognition, or if humans merge with technology to transcend our evolutionary limitations, might we encounter a reality as incomprehensible and indifferent as Lovecraft's fictional cosmos? Cosmicism ultimately forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about humanity's place in existence. Are we the central characters in a meaningful cosmic drama, or transient phenomena in an indifferent universe? Do our values reflect something fundamental about reality, or merely the contingent outcome of evolutionary processes? If the cosmos is genuinely indifferent to human concerns, can we still construct meaningful lives in the face of that indifference? Whether viewed as nihilistic horror or clear-eyed realism, Cosmicism challenges our desire to feel at home in the universe. It suggests that beyond our anthropomorphic projections and evolved cognitive frameworks lies a reality utterly indifferent to human meaning, a cosmos where, as Lovecraft wrote, there are no values in all infinity. Moral bioenhancement. What if we could take a pill that made us more compassionate? What if we could genetically engineer children predisposed to altruism? What if brain implants could suppress violent impulses or increase empathy? Welcome to the controversial frontier of moral bioenhancement, a philosophy that proposes using biotechnology to improve human moral capacities. We face unprecedented challenges that our evolved moral psychology is ill-equipped to handle, argues bioethicist Julian Savulescu. Climate change, weapons of mass destruction, and global inequality all require levels of cooperation and altruism that humans struggle to sustain. If we can safely enhance our moral capacities through biotechnology, we may have an obligation to do so. This argument represents a radical departure from traditional thinking about both morality and human enhancement. For centuries, moral improvement has been the domain of education, religion, culture, and personal development, not medical intervention. The idea that we might enhance morality the same way we enhance athletic performance or cognitive function strikes many as a dangerous category error. Moral bioenhancement emerged from the broader field of human enhancement ethics in the early 2000s, gaining prominence through the work of philosophers like Julian Savulescu, Ingmar Persson, and Thomas Douglas. Their starting premise is that human moral psychology evolved for small group living in resource-scarce environments, not for addressing complex global challenges requiring cooperation among billions of people. Our moral dispositions were shaped by natural selection in conditions very different from those we face today, explains Persson. We feel strong empathy toward identifiable individuals, but struggle to respond appropriately to statistical victims or future generations. We cooperate readily in small groups, but falter at global scales. These limitations threaten our survival in an interconnected world with powerful technologies. The most controversial aspect of moral bioenhancement isn't the diagnosis, but the proposed solution, using biotechnology to enhance moral capacities like empathy, fairness, and self-control, while diminishing tendencies toward aggression, xenophobia, and short-term thinking. This might involve pharmaceuticals, genetic selection or modification, neural implants, or non-invasive brain stimulation techniques. Some interventions already exist in primitive forms. SSRIs like Prozac can increase cooperation and reduce aggression in some contexts. Propranolol may reduce implicit racial bias. Oxytocin nasal sprays can temporarily increase trust and empathy toward in-group members. Deep brain stimulation can alter moral judgment and behavior when used for conditions like obsessive-compulsive disorder. But moral bioenhancement advocates envision more precise interventions targeting specific moral capacities. Imagine genetic screening allowing parents to select embryos predisposed to empathy and cooperation. Or drugs that enhance our ability to consider long-term consequences when making moral decisions. or neural implants that strengthen self-control when facing temptations to act selfishly or aggressively. This isn't science fiction, argues Savulescu. We already accept cognitive enhancement through education, moral enhancement through cultural practices, and medical interventions that affect behavior. Moral bioenhancement represents a natural extension of these accepted practices using new technological tools. Critics respond with multiple objections, starting with the fundamental question: who defines what constitutes moral improvement? History is littered with atrocities committed in the name of moral betterment. Without consensus on moral values, couldn't enhancement technologies become tools for imposing particular moral perspectives? Religious critics argue that moral bioenhancement usurps God's role in human moral development or reduces morality to neurochemistry rather than spiritual choice. Conservative critics worry about undermining traditional moral teaching and individual responsibility. Progressive critics fear that enhancement could reinforce existing power structures by fixing individuals rather than unjust social systems. The idea that we can reduce complex moral capacities to simple neurological interventions represents dangerous oversimplification, argues bioethicist Michael Sandel. Moral development requires struggle, deliberation, and connection to others, not pharmacological shortcuts. Perhaps the most fundamental objection involves freedom. True morality, many philosophers argue, requires freely chosen action. If a person acts morally only because their brain has been altered to make immoral choices difficult or impossible, have they acted morally at all? Is pharmacologically induced generosity truly generosity? Moral bioenhancement raises particularly troubling questions around consent and coercion. If these technologies truly benefit society, should they be mandated? Should parents be required to select for moral traits in their children? Should violent criminals undergo enforced moral enhancement as a condition of release? Who decides, and on what basis? The risks of mandatory moral bioenhancement vastly outweigh potential benefits, warns philosopher Robert Sparrow. Such programs would violate fundamental human rights and potentially create unprecedented forms of control over human behavior and development. Advocates respond that our moral behavior is already shaped by factors we don't choose: our genes, early environment, cultural contexts, so the idea of purely autonomous moral development is largely fictional. Moreover, they argue, we already accept many mandatory interventions that affect moral behavior, from education to legal penalties. If safe, effective moral bioenhancement could prevent serious harm, might it be justified on similar grounds? The debate becomes especially complex when considering global catastrophic risks. If moral bioenhancement could reduce the likelihood of nuclear war, climate disaster, or engineered pandemics, does the potential to save millions of lives justify controversial interventions? When existential risks are at stake, do traditional ethical boundaries need reconsideration? We face a parallel between human technological development and moral development, argues philosopher David Pearce. Our technological power has grown exponentially, while our moral capacities remain limited by our evolutionary history. This growing gap creates unprecedented dangers. Moral bioenhancement might help close this gap before our technological powers outstrip our moral wisdom. The controversy extends to whether moral bioenhancement would actually work as intended. Morality involves complex interactions between empathy, reasoning, intuition, and cultural factors. Attempting to enhance isolated components might disrupt this delicate balance, potentially creating unforeseen consequences. Someone with enhanced empathy, but diminished reasoning, might make worse moral decisions in some contexts, not better ones. Furthermore, many moral problems stem not from individual moral failures, but from collective action problems, institutional structures, and coordination challenges. Would enhancing individual moral capacities address these systemic issues, or create false confidence that bypasses necessary structural changes? Moral problems are rarely just about individual psychology, notes political philosopher Elizabeth Anderson. They involve power relations, institutional design, and complex social dynamics that biotechnological interventions can't address. Perhaps the most nuanced position comes from philosophers who see moral bioenhancement as potentially valuable but insufficient. These thinkers argue that biotechnological interventions might complement, but cannot replace, traditional approaches to moral development through education, institutional reform, and cultural change. As biotechnology advances and global challenges intensify, the debate around moral bioenhancement will likely grow more urgent. The philosophy raises fundamental questions about human nature, moral development, freedom, and our technological future. Whether you find the prospect of moral bioenhancement promising or disturbing likely depends on your views about what morality is, how it develops, and who should control its development. What remains certain is that the technologies that could enable moral bioenhancement continue to advance, whether we're ready for them or not. The controversial question isn't whether we'll gain the ability to influence moral capacities through biotechnology, but how we'll choose to use that ability and who will make those choices. Primitivism. The lights go out, your phone dies, the internet disappears. For most of us, this scenario represents a disaster, but for adherents of primitivism, it's salvation. The Industrial Revolution and its consequences have been a disaster for the human race. These words open the infamous manifesto of Theodore Kaczynski, the Unabomber, whose mail bombing campaign killed 3 people and injured 23 others between 1978 and 1995. Before his capture, his manifesto was published in the Washington Post and the New York Times, introducing millions to a radical critique of technological society that continues to resonate today. But primitivism isn't just the philosophy of a lone terrorist. It represents a profound challenge to our most basic assumptions about human progress, technological development, and the very meaning of civilization. And in an age of ecological collapse, surveillance capitalism, and technological alienation, its dark warnings have found new audiences. Primitivists believe that humanity took a wrong turn roughly 10,000 years ago with the development of agriculture. This Neolithic revolution, they argue, wasn't progress, but catastrophe. The beginning of hierarchy, environmental destruction, war, patriarchy, and psychological misery. Each technological advance since, from written language to industrial production to digital technology, has only accelerated our species' alienation from our evolutionary heritage and natural environment. The solution: abandon civilization and return to pre-agricultural hunter-gatherer ways of life. Nothing less can save us. This isn't merely lifestyle primitivism, occasional camping trips or digital detoxes. It's revolutionary primitivism, the belief that technological society must be actively dismantled. Some advocate gradual voluntary simplification. Others, like Kaczynski, have embraced more violent approaches. Civilization is like a jetliner, writes primitivist author John Zerzan. It's getting off the ground and it's going to crash. The real point is to bring it down. Our future lies in the past. Consider this. For 300,000 years, Homo sapiens lived as hunter-gatherers. Agriculture emerged only 10,000 years ago. Industrial civilization? Barely 250 years old. Digital technology? A mere half-century. From an evolutionary perspective, we're running software designed for Paleolithic conditions on industrial-age hardware, a mismatch with profound consequences. Archaeological evidence suggests that hunter-gatherers were often healthier than early agriculturalists. Skeletons from agricultural societies show more evidence of malnutrition, disease, and shorter stature than their forager predecessors. The first farmers worked longer hours for worse nutrition. As anthropologist Marshall Salins famously argued, hunter-gatherers represented the original affluent society, meeting their needs with just 3 to 5 hours of daily work. But the primitivist critique goes deeper than physical health. It's about what kind of beings we are. Picture yourself walking through a forest. You recognize edible plants, animal tracks, weather patterns. Your senses are alive. You exist in intimate relationship with your environment and community. This, primitivists argue, is authentic human existence, immediate, embodied, and connected. Now picture yourself scrolling through social media, sitting in traffic, staring at spreadsheets under fluorescent lights. Your body deteriorates from inactivity. Your attention fragments. Depression and anxiety plague you. This is civilized existence, mediated, abstract, and alienated. We are not meant to live like this, writes primitivist philosopher Derek Jensen. This culture is killing the planet. It is killing us. Critics dismiss primitivism as romantic fantasy, noting that hunter-gatherer life included hardship, violence, and early death. Without modern medicine, many of us wouldn't survive childhood. Without industrial agriculture, the planet couldn't support nearly 8 billion humans. The primitivist response is uncompromising. Better fewer humans living authentically than billions living as domesticated animals in technological systems that destroy the biosphere. Better the challenging reality of direct subsistence than the comfortable unreality of mediated existence. This is where primitivism becomes truly controversial. If civilization itself is the problem, how many must die in the transition to a post-technological world? What about those dependent on modern medicine? What about the knowledge and art civilization has produced? Some primitivists, like Zerzan, argue that depopulation would happen gradually through lower birth rates in a rewilded world. Others acknowledge that civilization's collapse would involve enormous suffering, but consider it inevitable. The only question is whether we manage the descent or let it happen chaotically. Kaczynski's darker vision imagined a revolutionary vanguard hastening technological society's collapse. His manifesto argued, "The industrial system will not break down purely as a result of revolutionary action. It will not be vulnerable to revolutionary attack unless its own internal problems of development lead it into very serious difficulties." Here lies the terrifying paradox at primitivism's core. It diagnoses profound problems within a system we inhabit, while proposing solutions that require being outside that system. The critique exists within civilization. The alternative exists only beyond it. Yet primitivism's power lies precisely in its uncompromising nature. It forces us to question assumptions we take for granted. That technology represents progress. That comfort equals well-being. That human flourishing means domination of nature. Consider how smartphones, hailed as miracles of connection, have restructured consciousness itself. The average American touches their phone 2,600 times daily. We interrupt conversations to check notifications. We experience anxiety when separated from our devices. Our attention spans shrink. Our capacity for deep thought erodes. Is this progress? The primitivist says no. Each technological advance further separates us from our evolved nature, creating psychological mismatches that manifest as modern epidemics of depression, anxiety, and alienation. Even mainstream psychology increasingly recognizes these mismatches. Evolutionary psychologists document how modern environments create evolutionary novel conditions our brains haven't adapted to handle. The biophilia hypothesis suggests humans have an innate need for connection with nature that urban environments frustrate. Research shows that time in natural settings reduces stress hormones, blood pressure, and symptoms of ADHD. What makes primitivism uniquely unsettling is how it challenges every political tradition. Conservatives celebrate traditional values while embracing industrial capitalism that destroys traditions. Progressives advocate for justice while using technologies that require exploitative global supply chains. Libertarians champion freedom while depending on systems that generate surveillance and control. Primitivism says, you cannot have technological civilization without domination of nature, of other humans, ultimately of ourselves. The critique we're making challenges not just how we live, but who we've become, says primitivist writer Kevin Tucker. For 10,000 years we've been fighting against wildness and intuition. For what? To work jobs we hate, to buy things we don't need? The philosophy resonates beyond explicitly primitivist circles. Movements from voluntary simplicity to rewilding to digital minimalism reflect discomfort with technological society. Films like Fight Club and Matrix depict civilization as a system of control to be escaped. indigenous resistance movements fighting extraction industries echo primitivist critiques. The COVID-19 pandemic provided a glimpse of what happens when complex technological systems falter, supply chains collapse, social systems break down. Climate change promises greater disruptions ahead. In this context, primitivism seems less like fringe theory and more like prophecy. The question isn't whether industrial civilization will end, writes activist Lierre Keith. The question is how. Perhaps primitivism's most valuable contribution isn't its proposed solution, but its radical diagnosis. By identifying civilization itself as problematic, not just particular social arrangements within civilization, it forces us to confront the deepest assumptions underlying our way of life. Even if we reject primitivism's call to abandon technology, we might still learn from its critique. Perhaps technological society needs not rejection, but radical restructuring. New forms that work with human nature rather than against it, that foster connection rather than alienation, that exist in balance with ecological systems rather than opposition to them. Or perhaps the primitivists are right, and our technological trajectory leads inevitably toward collapse. Perhaps the best we can do is prepare for a world with less energy, less technology, less mediation between ourselves and reality. Either way, primitivism stands as one of our most controversial philosophies, a mirror reflecting civilization's darkest contradictions back at itself, asking whether what we call progress might actually be regress, a 10,000-year detour from authentic human existence that's rapidly approaching its end. National Bolshevism. Imagine a political movement that combines the communist hammer and sickle with Nazi-like aesthetics, a philosophy that advocates for Soviet-style economics while embracing ethno-nationalism, a worldview where Stalin and Hitler aren't enemies but complementary revolutionary figures. This ideological chimera exists, and it's called National Bolshevism, perhaps the most deliberately transgressive political philosophy of the modern era. It stands as living proof that the traditional left-right political spectrum is inadequate to capture the full range of political possibility, or political horror. National Bolshevism, often shortened to Nazbol, emerged from the chaos of post-WWI Europe and found new life in the ruins of the Soviet Union. It represents the ultimate political taboo, the fusion of far-left economics with far-right nationalism, deliberately combining elements of ideologies that fought the bloodiest war in human history against each other. Its flag, a hammer and sickle in a white circle against a red background, mimicking the Nazi flag's design, perfectly encapsulates its provocative merger of seemingly irreconcilable extremes. The roots of this strange hybrid reach back to Weimar Germany, where disillusioned German communists like Ernst Niekisch advocated National Bolshevism as a third position between Western capitalism and Soviet internationalism. These early proponents envisioned a uniquely German path to socialism that rejected both American materialism and what they saw as Jewish-influenced Bolshevism. They sought to combine the economic revolution of communism with the Völkisch, ethnic nationalist elements of German far-right thought. This embryonic movement was ultimately crushed by the Nazis, who saw them as competitors for the revolutionary mantle. But the most notorious incarnation of National Bolshevism emerged decades later in post-Soviet Russia. As the USSR collapsed in 1991, Russians experienced a profound identity crisis. Overnight, their superpower status vanished, their economy imploded, and Western liberal capitalism rushed in to fill the vacuum. The trauma of this transition created fertile ground for radical ideologies that promised to restore Russian greatness while rejecting Western liberalism. Into this chaos stepped Eduard Limonov, a punk novelist, Soviet dissident, and political provocateur. Together with Alexander Dugin, an esoteric fascist philosopher obsessed with geopolitics and mysticism, they founded the National Bolshevik Party, NBP, in 1993. Limonov brought literary flair and countercultural appeal, while Dugin provided the ideological framework drawn from fourth political theory, his attempt to synthesize elements of communism, fascism, and religious traditionalism into a new anti-liberal worldview. The NBP deliberately cultivated shocking aesthetics. Their headquarters featured portraits of Stalin alongside Hitler. Members performed provocative direct actions, from occupying government buildings to throwing mayonnaise at politicians. Their newspaper published articles praising both Nazi and Soviet achievements. This wasn't just political positioning, but calculated transgression, a deliberate violation of the post-WW2 taboo against combining communist and fascist symbols and ideas. What makes National Bolshevism truly controversial isn't just its symbols, but its core beliefs. Nazbols advocate for a totalitarian state controlling the economy for the benefit of the ethnically defined nation. They reject both capitalism and liberal democracy as Western impositions that weaken national unity. They celebrate the strong leader principle while promising economic equality, but only for the dominant ethnic group. International solidarity is replaced with geopolitical struggle between civilizations, where Russia, or sometimes a broader Eurasian space, must defeat the liberal, globalist West. The movement's relationship with anti-Semitism is particularly disturbing. While some Nazbols downplay racial theories, many embrace conspiracy theories about Jewish control of global finance and media. They reframe class struggle in ethno-nationalist terms. The enemy isn't the bourgeoisie as a class, but foreign, often coded as Jewish, capital that exploits the national working class. This allows them to redirect legitimate economic grievances into ethnic resentment. After being banned in Russia in 2007, the movement splintered, with Dugin moving toward his Eurasianist geopolitical theories and greater influence within Russian political circles. Limonov formed the Other Russia Party, moderating some positions while maintaining the revolutionary posture. But the ideological virus they unleashed continued to spread online, mutating into new forms. In the digital age, National Bolshevism has gained an ironic second life as an internet aesthetic and meme, particularly among politically disaffected youth. The striking Nazbol flag and its transgressive merger of communist and fascist imagery appeal to those seeking to shock established sensibilities. Online communities dedicated to Nazbol gang often mix genuine extremism with ironic detachment, making it difficult to distinguish sincere believers from trolls, precisely the ambiguity that allows radical ideas to spread under the cover of humor. What makes National Bolshevism uniquely disturbing is how it exploits legitimate grievances about economic inequality and globalization while channeling them toward ethno-nationalist solutions. It offers a seductive narrative to those who feel economically left behind and culturally uprooted, promising both economic security and national greatness through opposition to global capitalism and liberal values. By positioning itself against both the capitalist right and the progressive left, it creates a political identity that feels rebellious and underdog-like, while actually promoting authoritarian conformity. The philosophy reveals something profound about extremist movements, that they often define themselves less by what they support than what they oppose. National Bolshevism's primary coherence comes from its hatred of liberalism, individualism, and globalization. Its positive program remains contradictory and unstable, promising liberation through submission to collective national will. This negative foundation makes it particularly dangerous, as it can adapt its specific policies while maintaining its fundamental opposition to liberal democracy. National Bolshevism challenges our understanding of political extremism. The conventional view that far-left and far-right ideologies are polar opposites fails to capture how they can fuse at their extremes. Both Stalinism and Nazism created totalitarian states that subordinated individual rights to collective goals, whether defined in class or racial terms. Both positioned themselves as revolutionary alternatives to liberal capitalism. National Bolshevism simply makes explicit the uncomfortable similarities between these supposedly opposed systems. The movement's influence extends beyond its limited membership. Elements of National Bolshevik thinking have infiltrated both far-right and far-left discourse, from certain strains of anti-imperialist leftism that defend authoritarian regimes as long as they oppose the West, to far-right groups that have adopted economic populism and anti-capitalist rhetoric. Steve Bannon's economic nationalism, certain strands of European populism, and even aspects of China's current system combine state economic control with nationalist fervor in ways that echo national Bolshevik themes. In Russia, while the official NBP no longer exists, its ideological fingerprints can be seen in the Kremlin's current hybrid of Soviet nostalgia, Russian orthodoxy, and anti-Western nationalism. Putin himself is no national Bolshevik, but his regime has absorbed elements of Dugin's Eurasianist geopolitics and cultivated a political atmosphere where Soviet communist symbols coexist with Russian imperial ones in a nationalist synthesis. What lesson should we draw from this disturbing philosophy? Perhaps most importantly, that economic insecurity and loss of collective identity create dangerous opportunities for radical ideologies that promise simple, authoritarian solutions. When legitimate economic concerns go unaddressed by mainstream politics, extremists can redirect that anger toward ethnic scapegoating. When people feel their cultural identity threatened by rapid change, nostalgic visions of national greatness become seductive. National Bolshevism serves as both warning and mirror, reflecting the dangers when legitimate grievances about economic inequality and cultural disorientation are channeled into authoritarian, ethno-nationalist directions. It reminds us that political extremes can merge in unexpected ways, producing hybrid threats to liberal democracy that don't fit neatly on a left-right spectrum. In an age of growing polarization and economic uncertainty, understanding this strange and disturbing philosophy isn't merely academic. It's essential for recognizing the warning signs of extremism in its many evolving forms. Antinatalism. Is bringing a child into this world an act of love or an act of harm? For most of human history, reproduction has been seen as life's central purpose, the fulfillment of evolutionary imperative, religious command, and personal fulfillment. But a growing philosophical movement challenges this fundamental assumption with a radical claim that creating new life is not a moral good, but a moral harm. This is antinatalism, perhaps the most counterintuitive ethical position possible in a world where childbearing remains our most celebrated biological function. A young man who is being initiated into the service of a god is required to castrate himself. Christianity, more subtly, castrates the intellect. With these words, 19th century philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer laid groundwork for what would eventually become antinatalism. Though he never argued explicitly against procreation, his pessimistic view of life as predominantly suffering influenced later thinkers who would take this final step, concluding that non-existence is preferable to existence. South African philosopher David Benatar, the most prominent contemporary antinatalist, argues his case through asymmetry. Coming into existence, he writes, is always a serious harm. His reasoning: while the presence of pain is bad and the presence of pleasure is good, the absence of pain is good, even when there's nobody to enjoy that absence, while the absence of pleasure is not bad unless someone exists to be deprived of it. In simpler terms, not existing means missing nothing while avoiding all suffering. Being born, by contrast, guarantees suffering with no guarantee that pleasure will outweigh it. Picture yourself before conception. You don't exist. You aren't deprived of Earth's pleasures because there is no you to experience deprivation. You also don't experience pain, disease, heartbreak, or death. Once born, all these sufferings become inevitable. Benatar argues the mathematics is clear. Non-existence contains zero suffering, while existence contains substantial suffering guaranteed. We cannot harm someone by not creating them, but we necessarily harm them by creating them. Every child is a roll of a terrible dice, writes antinatalist philosopher Thomas Ligotti. There are so many ways for humans to suffer, and very few ways for them to be happy. Ligotti, who combines antinatalism with cosmic pessimism, argues that consciousness itself is a tragic evolutionary mistake, one that made humans aware of death and suffering without providing adequate psychological defenses against them. In this view, creating new consciousness is perpetuating an error that condemns sentient beings to unnecessary suffering. It's tempting to dismiss antinatalism as mere depression, masquerading as philosophy. But its adherents include accomplished thinkers who distinguish philosophical conclusions from psychological states. They point out that many optimistic philosophies stem from psychological defense mechanisms, self-deception necessary to justify existence in a world where suffering is inevitable and often meaningless. To antinatalists, their position represents uncomfortable honesty rather than pathological despair. Consider these facts antinatalists highlight. Every human will experience physical pain, illness, loss of loved ones, and eventually death. Many will experience depression, betrayal, loneliness, violence, or poverty. Some will endure torture, assault, warfare, or terminal illness. Parents cannot guarantee their children protection from any of these outcomes. By bringing someone into existence, you subject them to these risks without their consent. An act antinatalists consider ethically indefensible. Why, asks Benatar, do people so readily accept an ethical asymmetry in other contexts, but resist it in the context of procreative ethics? We recognize that avoiding harm to existing people is more important than providing them with benefits. We don't inflict suffering on one person to provide pleasure to another. Yet when it comes to creating new people, we suddenly invoke potential benefits to justify guaranteed harms. Environmental antinatalists add climate change and ecological collapse to these considerations. Each new human born in developed nations will produce approximately 58.6 tons of carbon dioxide annually. Over a lifetime, that's thousands of tons per person, contributing to a climate emergency that threatens billions with suffering. From this perspective, reproduction isn't just harmful to the individual created but to countless existing and future people affected by environmental degradation. Perhaps most provocatively, antinatalists challenge the selflessness parents claim motivates reproduction. No one has children for the children's benefit, they argue, since the child doesn't exist before conception and therefore has no interest to benefit. People have children to satisfy their own desires, for genetic continuity, meaning, status, or emotional fulfillment. These may be natural desires, but they don't justify creating new suffering. Critics of antinatalism offer several compelling counter-arguments. Religious thinkers argue that life, despite its hardships, is a divine gift with transcendent purpose. Existentialists contend that suffering itself gives life meaning through how we respond to it. Utilitarians suggest that most lives contain more pleasure than pain, making existence net positive. Evolutionary psychologists point out that reproduction is our most basic biological drive, suggesting antinatalism represents a maladaptive psychological state. Perhaps most effectively, critics argue that antinatalism misrepresents lived human experience. While existence does guarantee suffering, it also offers beauty, love, discovery, and meaning that antinatalism seemingly undervalues. Most people, when asked, report being glad they exist, suggesting that while Benatar's asymmetry makes logical sense, it fails to capture how humans actually experience their lives. Additionally, if antinatalism were universally adopted, it would result in human extinction, an outcome many find intuitively troubling, suggesting our moral intuitions extend beyond individual welfare to species continuation. Antinatalists respond that extinction through non-reproduction would be peaceful and harm no one, while perpetuating humanity ensures infinite future suffering. What makes antinatalism particularly controversial is how it challenges our deepest biological and cultural assumptions. Unlike most ethical positions that seek to improve existence, antinatalism questions existence itself. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. Is life truly a gift, or something we rationalize because we have no choice? Do we reproduce for ourselves or for the beings we create? Can any amount of pleasure justify guaranteed suffering? The philosophy creates strange political alignments. Conservative religious groups reject antinatalism for opposing divine commands to be fruitful and multiply. Progressive environmentalists sometimes embrace it for its ecological implications. Both individualist libertarians and communitarian socialists can find aspects that resonate with their values around consent and collective welfare. Though few people fully embrace antinatalism, its influence extends beyond philosophy departments. Declining birth rates across developed nations reflect growing voluntary childlessness, often motivated by concerns antinatalists would recognize, from climate anxiety to economic precarity to ethical qualms about bringing children into an uncertain future. While most child-free individuals wouldn't identify as antinatalists, the philosophy articulates arguments that increasingly influence reproductive decisions. Whether we ultimately reject or accept its conclusions, antinatalism serves a valuable function, forcing us to examine assumptions so fundamental we rarely question them. It demands justifications for what we typically take as self-evident. It asks whether our biological imperatives align with our ethical principles, and it reminds us that creating life is perhaps the most profound moral decision humans make, one deserving deeper reflection than tradition or instinct alone can provide. As philosopher Peter Singer notes, the question of whether to have children is, from an ethical perspective, fundamentally different from most other decisions we make. Antinatalism, whatever its flaws, forces us to confront this difference with an intellectual honesty few other philosophies demand. Anarcho-Monarchism. How can absolute freedom coexist with absolute authority? How can the rejection of all rulers exist alongside the elevation of a single ruler? Welcome to one of political philosophy's strangest contradictions, Anarcho-Monarchism, a seemingly impossible fusion of anarchism's opposition to hierarchical power and monarchy's embrace of it. This baffling hybrid ideology proposes that the purest freedom might paradoxically require the strongest authority, that abolishing the state might necessitate establishing a king. All mankind is a single monarch and should act as such, wrote J.R.R. Tolkien in one of his letters, hinting at the curious fusion that would later be labeled Anarcho-Monarchism. Though primarily known as a fantasy author, Tolkien described himself politically as an anarchist who would accept a monarch, establishing early foundations for this contradictory philosophy. Unlike most political theories that emerged from formal philosophical treatises, Anarcho-Monarchism developed organically through literary speculation, internet communities, and political thought experiments. The philosophy appears at first glance to be a mere oxymoron. Anarchism seeks to abolish coercive hierarchies, while monarchy represents perhaps the most explicit hierarchical structure possible. Yet advocates argue these apparent opposites share crucial values: skepticism toward bureaucratic states, preference for organic social orders over artificial ones, and belief that power functions better when personalized rather than systematized. Under a monarch, man is at least a free man. The arbitrary whim of an individual is identifiable, resistible, and temporary, argues conservative philosopher Roger Scruton, reflecting anarcho-monarchist sensibilities. Under bureaucracy, man becomes a number, inserted into a process that has no face, no name, and no assignable duration. This perspective highlights anarcho-monarchism's central insight. Modern democratic states might actually constrain freedom more effectively than traditional monarchies, precisely because their power is diffuse, anonymous, and therefore more difficult to resist. A visible king with personal quirks and limitations presents a clearer target for resistance than faceless bureaucratic systems, where responsibility dissipates across countless officials and regulations. At its most coherent, anarcho-monarchism proposes that genuine anarchy, in the sense of voluntary social organization without coercive state structures, might paradoxically be better protected by a symbolic monarch than by republican institutions. The monarch serves not as an active ruler enforcing laws, but as a guardian of nothing, a figure whose very presence prevents the emergence of more intrusive bureaucratic forms of governance. Some versions suggest that monarchy's ceremonial nature actually makes it less invasive than democracies. When power resides in tradition-bound rituals rather than active legislation, it may interfere less in daily life. Unlike democratic politicians continuously pushing new regulations to demonstrate activity to voters, a monarch secure in their position needs no such constant assertion of authority. Democracy is the worst form of despotism, claimed French philosopher Ernest Renan, whose thinking influences modern anarcho-monarchists. It is the tyranny of the majority, the most abominable tyranny because it works with the mask of liberty. From this perspective, democratic processes themselves become mechanisms of control more pervasive than monarchical authority ever was. The philosophy takes different forms depending on whether it leans more anarchist or monarchist. Anarchist-leaning proponents view the monarch as a purely symbolic figure preventing power consolidation elsewhere, a paradoxical anti-king whose existence precludes more dangerous forms of authority. Monarchist-leaning adherents emphasize how a king personifies the natural order of society, allowing genuine community self-organization beneath the monarch's protection. Internet communities have developed more idiosyncratic versions, including every man a king interpretations, where each individual functions as sovereign over their own domain, protected by shared recognition of everyone's monarchical dignity. This conception imagines a society of micro-kingdoms voluntarily cooperating without centralized authority, a kind of monarchical spin on individualist anarchism. What makes Anarcho-Monarchism particularly controversial is its rejection of mainstream democratic values and institutions. Where most modern political philosophies accept democracy as a foundational good, Anarcho-Monarchism questions whether voting, representation, and majority rule actually secure freedom. This challenge to democratic consensus places it outside conventional political categorization, neither clearly left nor right, but perpendicular to standard political spectrums. Critics argue that the philosophy simply fails to resolve its fundamental contradiction. Anarchism's opposition to hierarchy cannot meaningfully coexist with monarchy's embracement of it, they contend. Any actual implementation would necessarily become either functional anarchism with merely symbolic monarchical elements, or functional monarchy with merely symbolic anarchist elements, not a true synthesis. Anarcho-monarchism represents not serious political theory, but political aesthetics, argues political scientist Francis Fukuyama. It appeals to those who find both bureaucratic democracy and revolutionary politics spiritually unsatisfying, offering instead a romantic vision disconnected from practical governance. Others criticize the philosophy for its potentially reactionary implications. By romanticizing pre-modern power structures, anarcho-monarchism might provide intellectual cover for authoritarianism dressed in traditional garb. The emphasis on natural hierarchy and organic social order has sometimes attracted those with troubling views on race, gender, and class, though many anarcho-monarchists explicitly reject such associations. Defenders respond that the contradiction is precisely the point, a dialectical tension that illuminates shortcomings in both anarchist and traditionalist thinking. The philosophy functions less as a blueprint for implementation and more as a critique exposing how modern democratic states paradoxically constrain freedom through diffuse, unaccountable power structures more effectively than traditional authorities ever could. The philosophy finds surprising expression in fictional world-building. Tolkien's Middle-earth features ideal monarchs who rarely exercise direct power, instead enabling free peoples to largely govern themselves. Fantasy fiction often explores societies where kings serve as guardians of order without micromanaging their realms, a romantic vision that influences anarcho-monarchist thought. The most improper job of any man is bossing other men, Tolkien wrote. Not one in a million is fit for it, and least of all those who seek the opportunity. This sentiment captures the philosophy's paradoxical heart, simultaneously recognizing authority's necessity while deeply skeptical of anyone actively seeking it. In practical terms, the closest real-world approximation might be constitutional monarchies like the United Kingdom or Sweden, where ceremonial monarchs coexist with democratic institutions. However, true anarcho-monarchists would argue these examples still contain too much state apparatus and bureaucratic control to reflect their ideal. Contemporary interest in the philosophy has grown alongside disillusionment with democratic processes and bureaucratic complexity. As trust in institutions declines across the political spectrum, anarcho-monarchism offers a conceptual alternative to both revolutionary leftism and managerial liberalism, an escape hatch from the entire framework of modern politics. Whether viewed as profound paradox or pretentious contradiction, Anarcho-Monarchism challenges us to question our assumptions about authority, freedom, and political organization. By fusing seemingly opposite principles, it creates a philosophical mirror reflecting the contradictions within mainstream political systems themselves, where freedom is promised through mechanisms of control, and where authority is exercised through claims of representing the people it governs. Neo-reaction. Democracy is a failure. Equality is a dangerous myth. Progress is an illusion. Freedom has made us weaker, not stronger. And the Enlightenment, with its faith in reason, liberty, and human advancement, was the greatest intellectual mistake in history. These aren't slogans from some long-defeated authoritarian movement. They represent the core beliefs of neo-reaction, NRX, a 21st century intellectual movement that rejects virtually every political principle of the modern world. Its adherents don't want to reform democracy. They want to replace it with techno-futuristic monarchies run by CEO kings. They don't seek to perfect equality. They believe hierarchy is natural and necessary. They don't aim to extend liberalism. They want to abandon it entirely. Neo-reaction emerged from the blogs of computer scientist Curtis Yarvin, writing as Mencius Moldbug, and philosopher Nick Land in the late 2000s. Yarvin, a Silicon Valley programmer, published sprawling manifestos arguing that democracy inevitably degenerates into mob rule, manipulated by an unaccountable elite he called the Cathedral, the complex of universities, media, and bureaucracies that enforce progressive orthodoxy. Land, a former academic philosopher, contributed accelerationist theories about capitalism and technology evolving beyond human control, potentially creating post-human hierarchies based on cognitive ability. Cthulhu always swims left, wrote Yarvin, using Lovecraftian imagery to describe how democracies inevitably drift toward progressivism, regardless of electoral outcomes. In NRX thought, this leftward movement isn't progress but societal decay, undermining natural hierarchies, promoting dysfunctional egalitarianism, and weakening civilization through unrestricted immigration, welfare dependence, and the elevation of victimhood. The solution? Replace democracy with neo-cameralism, a system where nations are run as corporations, with sovereign power held by a CEO monarch who rules through strict property rights. Citizens become shareholders, with voting power proportional to their investment. Those unhappy with their government could exit to a competing sovereign corporation, creating a market of governance systems competing for the most productive citizens. The United States is a communist country, Yarvin provocatively declares, not because it has collective ownership of production, but because it has abandoned natural hierarchies for what NRX sees as the quasi-religious dogma of human equality. From the neo-reactionary perspective, attempts to engineer social equality against natural human variation are as doomed as Soviet economic planning and equally tyrannical. Neo-reaction's historiography is equally controversial. It views the Enlightenment not as humanity's emergence from superstition into reason, but as a catastrophic wrong turn, replacing functional religious and monarchical authority with unstable democratic systems based on fundamentally flawed premises about human nature. The American and French revolutions weren't advances, but disasters that unleashed destructive egalitarian ideologies that would eventually produce communism, fascism, and modern progressivism. What makes neo-reaction particularly unsettling is its explicitly anti-egalitarian stance on human groups. While claiming to reject crude racism, NRX embraces human biodiversity, the belief that human populations differ significantly in cognitive abilities and behavioral tendencies due to evolutionary pressures. These differences, they argue, explain persistent disparities between groups better than theories of discrimination or historical injustice. This aspect of NRX thought has made it particularly attractive to white nationalists and the alt-right, though neo-reactionaries themselves generally disavow these connections. The movement's technological focus adds another controversial dimension. Many neo-reactionaries work in technology and view Silicon Valley's meritocratic culture as a model for broader society. They embrace transhumanist ideas about technological enhancement and artificial intelligence, envisioning a future where cognitive elites merge with technology to create new forms of governance beyond democratic limitations. Unlike traditional conservatives who look backward to religious authority, neo-reactionaries look forward to techno-futurist hierarchies managed by superhuman intelligence. "We don't want to install Windows 1.0 when we could have Windows 10, explains one neo-reactionary blogger, arguing that reverting to traditional monarchy would be insufficient. Instead, they seek to build entirely new political systems incorporating modern technological capabilities, social credit systems, predictive algorithms, and cognitive enhancement to create stable hierarchical societies immune to democratic pressures. Critics from across the political spectrum find neo-reaction's ideas not just wrong, but dangerous. Progressives view it as pseudo-intellectual cover for white supremacy and authoritarianism. Traditional conservatives see its rejection of religion and embrace of transhumanism as deeply troubling. Classical liberals and libertarians reject its abandonment of individual rights in favor of centralized authority. Even other anti-democratic thinkers often find neo-reaction's techno-futurism too coldly rationalistic, lacking any moral or spiritual foundation. More fundamentally, critics argue that neo-reaction fundamentally misdiagnoses modern problems. Democratic dysfunctions don't prove democracy's inherent failure any more than monarchical abuses proved monarchy couldn't work. The persistence of inequality doesn't demonstrate equality's impossibility any more than the persistence of disease proves medicine is worthless. And technological capability doesn't automatically confer political wisdom or ethical insight. Yet despite these criticisms, or perhaps because of them, neo-reactionary ideas have spread beyond obscure blogs into broader discourse, particularly within technology circles and among young men disillusioned with progressive politics. While few explicitly identify as neo-reactionaries, NRX concepts about democracy's fundamental flaws, the unsustainability of egalitarianism, and the need for strong leadership increasingly appear in mainstream conservative and libertarian conversations. What makes neo-reaction particularly relevant today is how it challenges fundamental assumptions across the political spectrum. For progressives who see history as the steady expansion of equality and rights, neo-reaction offers a dark mirror, a vision of technological future built on hierarchy rather than equality. For conservatives wedded to American constitutional traditions, it questions whether the founders' Republican experiment was ever viable long-term. For libertarians who believe in market solutions, it pushes market logic into the domain of governance itself, but sacrifices individual rights in the process. Whether viewed as prescient critique or dangerous reactionary fantasy, neo-reaction represents one of the most intellectually ambitious challenges to democratic liberal consensus in recent decades. In an era of democratic backsliding, technological disruption, and growing inequality, its provocations force defenders of liberal democracy to articulate why equality matters, why democratic governance still works, and why the Enlightenment project, for all its flaws, remains humanity's best path forward. Neo-reaction's greatest value may lie not in its prescriptions, but in its criticisms, identifying real problems in democratic systems that, if left unaddressed, might ultimately validate its darkest predictions. By taking democracy's discontents to their logical conclusion, neo-reaction holds up a mirror to liberal society's deepest contradictions and challenges us to resolve them within the democratic framework, or risk seeing more extreme alternatives gain appeal in our technologically accelerating future. Radical virtual ethics. Is torturing a virtual character morally wrong? Can you commit adultery in virtual reality? Should killing someone's avatar be treated as a form of assault? As our lives increasingly migrate into digital spaces, a controversial philosophical movement called radical virtual ethics argues that the moral significance of our online actions equals, and sometimes exceeds, what we do in physical reality. The distinction between virtual and real is itself an outdated concept, argues philosopher Michael Madari. Our brains process virtual experiences using many of the same neural pathways as physical ones. The emotional and psychological impacts are often identical. This emerging philosophy directly challenges our intuitive separation between just a game and real life. When most people torture a character in Grand Theft Auto or slaughter enemies in Call of Duty, they feel no moral qualms. These are just pixels after all. The entire point of virtual spaces is that normal rules don't apply. We can experiment, play, and transgress without real-world consequences. Radical virtual ethics rejects this separation as increasingly untenable and potentially dangerous. As virtual reality technology improves, as we spend more hours in digital spaces, and as the line between virtual and physical blurs, the moral significance of our digital actions fundamentally changes. The philosophy has roots in early internet ethics but gained momentum with the rise of immersive technologies. In 2016, when a woman was virtually groped in the VR game QuiVR, her physical body remained untouched, yet she described the experience as violating and traumatic. The game's developers quickly added a personal bubble feature, acknowledging that something morally significant had occurred despite no physical contact. Psychological harm is real harm, explains digital ethicist Yvette Wone. If someone experiences genuine trauma from a virtual interaction, the artificial nature of the space doesn't negate the authentic suffering that results. Radical virtual ethics extends this reasoning to its logical conclusion. If virtual spaces can produce real psychological impacts, then actions within these spaces carry genuine moral weight. This leads to provocative claims that challenge our legal and ethical frameworks. Children who abuse virtual pets may be developing morally problematic character traits, despite no real animals being harmed. A person who habitually engages in virtual murder may be cultivating violent dispositions that reflect poorly on their character, regardless of whether they ever act physically. Sexual infidelity in virtual spaces may constitute a genuine betrayal of relationship trust, even without physical intimacy. What makes this philosophical position truly controversial is its challenge to one of the great promises of digital technology: consequence-free exploration. Video games and virtual worlds have always offered spaces where normal rules are suspended, where we can experiment with identities, actions, and scenarios impossible or forbidden in physical reality. If moral rules fully extend into these spaces, this freedom vanishes. The entire point of virtual worlds is their separation from physical constraints, argues game designer Frank Lantz, critiquing radical virtual ethics. Imposing real-world moral frameworks on these spaces fundamentally misunderstands their purpose and value. The controversy intensifies when considering legal implications. Should virtual assault be prosecutable? Should digital property have legal protections similar to physical property? Should persistent harassment in virtual spaces be treated as seriously as its real-world equivalent? Belgium and South Korea have already prosecuted theft of virtual goods under existing laws, while countries like Germany and Japan struggle to apply traditional legal frameworks to digital contexts. Some radical virtual ethicists go further, suggesting that as artificial intelligence advances, we may need to consider the moral status of purely digital entities themselves. Philosopher Thomas Metzinger proposes that sufficiently complex simulations might someday create conditions for digital suffering, raising the disturbing possibility that virtual worlds could become sites of moral harm, even without human participants. If we create digital entities capable of subjective experience, Metzinger argues, we assume moral responsibilities toward them, regardless of their non-physical nature. Critics find these extensions absurd. How can we have moral duties toward entities that exist only as code? How can actions in designed spaces, governed by arbitrary rules, carry the same moral weight as actions in physical reality? The comparison seems to trivialize actual suffering by equating it with digital simulations. Philosopher David Chalmers offers a more moderate position, suggesting a virtual realism that acknowledges both the genuine impact of virtual experiences and their distinct nature. Virtual actions have real consequences for human psychology and social relationships, he argues, without necessarily being identical to their physical equivalents. A virtual stabbing is not a physical stabbing, Chalmers writes, but neither is it nothing. It exists in its own ontological category with its own moral significance. The most nuanced versions of radical virtual ethics don't claim perfect equivalence between virtual and physical actions. Instead, they argue that as our technologies become more immersive, as our digital identities become more integrated with our overall identities, and as we spend more time in virtual spaces, the moral significance of our actions in these spaces increases proportionally. What makes this philosophical movement particularly relevant now is the accelerating development of the metaverse, persistent virtual spaces where people work, socialize, create, and trade. Companies like Meta, formerly Facebook, are investing billions in creating immersive digital worlds where people will spend significant portions of their lives. If these visions materialize, the separation between virtual and physical realities will blur further. The controversies around radical virtual ethics connect to deeper philosophical questions about the nature of harm, the relationship between mind and body, and how technology reshapes human experience. If harm is fundamentally psychological rather than physical, then the artificial nature of virtual spaces becomes less morally relevant. If our consciousness increasingly spans both physical and digital domains, then perhaps our ethical frameworks must follow. The question isn't whether virtual actions have moral significance, argues technology ethicist Shannon Valor, but how we develop ethical frameworks that appropriately capture that significance without collapsing important distinctions. This debate isn't merely academic. Parents must decide whether to police their children's virtual behavior as extensions of their character or dismiss it as just a game. Couples must determine whether virtual infidelity constitutes a relationship violation. Game designers must consider whether enabling certain virtual actions makes them complicit in potentially harmful experiences. As artificial intelligence, virtual reality, and augmented reality technologies advance, the questions raised by radical virtual ethics will only become more pressing. How we answer them will shape not just our digital spaces, but our understanding of morality itself in an age where reality increasingly exists on a spectrum rather than as a binary. The most profound insight of radical virtual ethics may be that technology doesn't just give us new things to do, it fundamentally changes what it means to be human. As our experiences, relationships, and identities extend into digital spaces, our moral frameworks must either evolve accordingly or risk becoming dangerously outdated. Whether we ultimately embrace or reject the equivalence between virtual and physical actions, the questions raised by this controversial philosophy force us to examine assumptions about reality, identity, and ethics that we've long taken for granted. In a world where the digital and physical increasingly converge, these questions are not merely philosophical curiosities, but urgent practical concerns. Ultra-communitarianism. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. This line from Star Trek sounds noble, even self-evident. But what happens when we take this principle to its extreme? When the community's needs not only outweigh individual rights, but essentially eliminate them? When personal autonomy, privacy, and even identity become viewed as dangerous indulgences that undermine social harmony? Ultra-communitarianism isn't just an abstract thought experiment. From ancient Sparta to modern North Korea, from religious communes to digital surveillance states, various societies have embodied aspects of this controversial philosophy that subordinates individual existence almost entirely to collective purposes. Let me introduce you to Chen Wei, a fictional citizen of a hypothetical ultra-communitarian society. Chen wakes at 5 a.m. to the community alarm. He doesn't choose his breakfast. Nutritionists have calculated optimal caloric intake for his body type and assigned role. His clothing, identical to others in his work unit, was selected for efficiency, not self-expression. Before leaving his dormitory, private homes being considered wasteful, he checks the community message board for today's mandatory discussion topics. At work, Chen doesn't pursue personal ambition, but fills the position community planners have determined maximizes collective utility. His romantic partner was suggested by compatibility algorithms that prioritize genetic diversity and shared ideological commitment. His leisure activities aren't chosen, but prescribed for optimal social cohesion and physical health. Chen never votes on individual rights. Such concepts are considered dangerous abstractions. Privacy is considered selfish concealment. Surveillance is omnipresent. But Chen has nothing to hide because wanting to hide implies antisocial tendencies. This scenario might seem dystopian to Western liberals, but ultra-communitarians would describe it differently. A society free from alienation, where everyone belongs, where resources are distributed according to need, where cooperation replaces competition, and where collective purpose gives meaning to individual lives. Liberal individualism has created epidemics of loneliness, anxiety, and despair, argues communitarian philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre. When we prioritize individual choice above community bonds, we don't get freedom, we get isolation. Ultra-communitarianism takes this critique to its logical conclusion, arguing that the very concept of the autonomous individual is a dangerous fiction. We are fundamentally social beings, shaped entirely by our communities. Our thoughts, preferences, and sense of self emerge from collective contexts. Therefore, subordinating individual desires to community needs isn't oppression, but liberation from the illusion of separate selfhood. Throughout history, various societies have embodied elements of ultra-communitarian thinking. Ancient Sparta subjected citizens to collective living from childhood, with individual needs subordinated entirely to military readiness. Medieval monasteries required members to abandon personal property and submit completely to community rules. Maoist China during the Cultural Revolution sought to eliminate bourgeois individualism through communal living arrangements, public self-criticism sessions, and the abolition of private pursuits. What makes ultra-communitarianism particularly controversial today is how it challenges fundamental assumptions of modern liberal societies. Since the Enlightenment, Western political philosophy has increasingly centered individual rights, personal autonomy, and private conscience. The very idea that these might be not just balanced against community needs, but fundamentally rejected strikes at the heart of liberal democratic values. The philosophy becomes even more provocative when considering modern technology's potential for implementing communitarian principles. China's social credit system, which rates citizens on community beneficial behaviors, represents one real-world application. But imagine these capabilities extended further: AI algorithms determining optimal social roles for each person, continuous biometric monitoring, ensuring conformity to community norms, neural interfaces synchronizing emotional responses among community members. Defenders of ultra-communitarianism point to genuine problems in individualist societies that their approach addresses. Social isolation has reached epidemic levels in Western nations. Economic individualism has produced staggering inequality. Environmental devastation results partly from prioritizing individual consumption over collective welfare. Perhaps most fundamentally, the myth of the self-made individual ignores our complete dependence on social infrastructure, shared knowledge, and collective labor. Critics respond that ultra-communitarianism fundamentally misunderstands human nature. While humans are indeed social creatures, we also possess an irreducible individuality that cannot be eliminated without causing profound psychological harm. Historical attempts to subordinate individuals entirely to collective purposes have invariably produced not harmony, but oppression, typically benefiting those who define community needs, while suppressing dissent as antisocial. The philosophy reveals particularly troubling implications for minority rights. When community needs are paramount, numerical minorities have little protection against majority preferences. Religious dissenters, political critics, sexual minorities, and cultural outsiders become problems to be corrected rather than differences to be accommodated. The history of ultra-communitarian experiments rarely shows tolerance for diversity. Yet these critiques haven't prevented ultra-communitarian ideas from gaining new adherents, particularly among those disillusioned with individualism's excesses. Post-liberal thinkers on both right and left increasingly question whether the liberal order's emphasis on individual choice has undermined the collective bonds necessary for human flourishing. Faced with atomized societies, environmental collapse, and technological disruption, some see stronger community control as the only viable response. What's particularly unsettling is how elements of ultra-communitarianism appear in seemingly opposite political movements. Right-wing nationalists subordinate individual rights to national collective identity. Left-wing identity politics sometimes emphasizes group solidarity over individual conscience. Religious fundamentalists prioritize doctrinal conformity over personal spiritual journeys. Surveillance capitalists harvest individual data for collective behavior modification. Different as these movements are, each contains strains of thinking that subordinate individual autonomy to collective purposes. The COVID-19 pandemic revealed similar tensions. Collective health measures necessarily restricted individual freedoms, but societies differed dramatically in how they balanced these concerns. Some Asian nations with stronger communitarian traditions implemented more comprehensive collective measures with greater compliance and often better outcomes. Western nations struggled more with resistance to mask mandates and lockdowns based on individual rights claims. This raises uncomfortable questions about whether liberal individualism can effectively address collective action problems like pandemics and climate change. When individual freedom to choose becomes freedom to harm the commons, is some form of communitarian thinking necessary? Can we develop approaches that preserve essential individual rights while recognizing our fundamental interdependence? Some theorists propose a middle path, a responsive communitarianism that balances individual rights with community needs, rather than subordinating one entirely to the other. This approach recognizes both our social nature and our irreducible individuality, seeking institutions that nurture community while protecting core personal freedoms. Perhaps ultra-communitarianism's greatest value lies not in its prescription, but in its challenge, forcing defenders of individual rights to articulate why autonomy matters, why privacy deserves protection, why conscience should remain personal. In questioning what many take for granted, it pushes us to examine whether we've struck the right balance between our lives as individuals and our existence as community members. As you consider your own response to these ideas, ask yourself, how much of your identity emerged from communities you didn't choose? How many of your personal preferences were shaped by social influences? And how much individual freedom would you willingly sacrifice for greater social harmony? Your answers might reveal more communitarian tendencies than you expect. Dark ecology. Traditional environmentalism tells a comforting story. Once upon a time, pristine nature existed in perfect harmony. Then humans, especially industrial civilization, disrupted this balance. If only we could return to sustainable practices, protect wilderness, and live more lightly on the earth, harmony would be restored. This narrative, with its clear villains, victims, and path to redemption, underpins mainstream environmental thought. Dark ecology shatters this comforting myth. This controversial philosophical movement argues that nature has never been harmonious or balanced, that humans cannot be separated from nature, and that the very concept of pristine wilderness is a destructive fantasy. Dark ecologists embrace nature's disturbing aspects, its cruelty, chaos, indifference, and constant, violent transformation, rejecting environmentalism's romantic idealization of a pristine natural world. The environment was never stable, balanced, or harmonious, writes philosopher Timothy Morton, dark ecology's primary theorist. We can't save it because it doesn't exist as an entity separate from us. And we must confront the shadow of ecological awareness, the grief, horror, and guilt that accompany our realization of massive environmental disruption. Dark ecology emerged from philosophical traditions including object-oriented ontology, speculative realism, and posthumanism. These movements reject human-centered thinking and blur boundaries between human and non-human, artificial and natural. But dark ecology's most controversial aspect is its challenge to environmentalism itself, arguing that traditional green thinking perpetuates harmful dualisms and prevents effective responses to ecological crisis. The movement's provocations begin with its rejection of nature as a concept. There is no such thing as nature, Morton declares, only a long list of items including ourselves. This statement scandalizes traditional environmentalists, for whom protecting nature from human interference is the central mission. Dark ecologists counter that the very idea of nature as something separate from humanity creates the exploitative relationship environmentalists claim to oppose. Consider wilderness preservation, environmentalism's sacred cause. Dark ecologists point out that creating pristine wilderness often involved removing indigenous peoples who had shaped those landscapes for millennia. The wilderness myth erases human history and reinforces a false binary, pure nature versus human corruption. This binary thinking, they argue, doesn't protect the environment, but enables its exploitation by defining everything touched by humans as already fallen. Putting something called nature on a pedestal and admiring it from afar does for the environment what patriarchy does for the figure of woman, Morton argues. It paradoxically produces the very distance it claims to overcome. Even more controversial is dark ecology's embrace of the dark aspects of nature. Traditional environmentalism emphasizes harmony, balance, and cooperation in natural systems. Dark ecologists highlight predation, parasitism, disease, waste, extinction, and indifference. Nature isn't a benevolent mother, but an assemblage of entities pursuing their interests with complete indifference to others. The food chain isn't beautiful harmony, but a system of eating and being eaten. Nature's processes produced both flowers and flesh-eating bacteria, both breathtaking landscapes and horrific parasites that consume their hosts from within. The ecological thought is intrinsically dark, mysterious, and open, writes Morton. It is about acknowledging the unknowable and unspeakable. This darkness contrasts sharply with environmentalism's often moralistic certainty about right relationships with nature. Perhaps most provocatively, dark ecology rejects sustainability as an ideal. Sustainable practices presuppose a stable system to be maintained, but if nature is constant transformation rather than balance, sustainability becomes conceptually incoherent. Instead, dark ecology embraces concepts like becoming and emergence, acknowledging that future ecological states will not and cannot resemble past ones. This philosophy proves particularly controversial when addressing climate change. Traditional environmentalists advocate reducing human impacts to restore natural balance. Dark ecologists argue that climate change, while devastating, isn't human desecration of a pristine system, but humans becoming a geological force within nature. The appropriate response isn't trying to restore an imagined pristine past, but acknowledging our entanglement with countless other entities in shaping Earth's future. We're going to have to learn to live with the weirdness of the fact that, for instance, we've caused global warming, and that global warming exists, explains Morton. This weirdness is intrinsic to our ecological situation. It's very hard to realize that you're swimming in the entity that is also drowning you. Critics argue that dark ecology offers no practical guidance for addressing ecological crises. If nature isn't balanced, if sustainability is conceptually flawed, if wilderness protection reinforces harmful dualisms, what should we actually do? Without clear moral frameworks distinguishing better from worse human actions, does dark ecology simply justify continued exploitation? Defenders respond that dark ecology provides deeper, more effective foundations for environmental action. By acknowledging our inescapable entanglement with non-human entities, rather than pretending we can stand outside nature, we take fuller responsibility for our impacts. By recognizing that all human activity shapes ecological systems, we move beyond simplistic prohibitions against interference toward conscious, careful interventions. British environmentalist Paul Kingsnorth, influenced by dark ecology, argues, "I don't think humans are able to save the planet. I think that's a self-defeating fantasy. But I do think we can change our attitude to it, and I think that might be the beginning of something transformative." Dark ecology creates especially provocative intersections with technology and conservation. Traditional environmentalism opposes technological solutions to ecological problems, preferring natural processes. Dark ecologists question whether any meaningful distinction exists between natural and artificial. Is a beaver dam natural, but a human dam artificial? Are genetically modified organisms fundamentally different from those modified through selective breeding? If humans are part of nature, aren't our creations also natural? This reasoning leads to controversial positions on issues like rewilding, geoengineering, de-extinction, and synthetic biology. Dark ecologists might support technological interventions traditional environmentalists consider sacrilegious, not because technology will save us, but because the natural, artificial distinction doesn't hold up to philosophical scrutiny. For mainstream environmentalists, dark ecology represents dangerous heresy, undermining the conceptual foundations of environmental protection when action is desperately needed. For others, particularly younger environmentalists disillusioned with traditional approaches, it offers liberation from rigid thinking that hasn't effectively addressed ecological crises. We're not going to address the problem of hydrocarbon use by pointing at it and saying, "That's artificial, that's bad," Morton argues. What we need instead is to reshape our relationship with all the beings with whom we coexist. Perhaps dark ecology's most significant contribution isn't its specific claims, but how it forces us to examine unquestioned assumptions underlying environmental thought. By challenging concepts like nature, wilderness, sustainability, and balance, it creates space for new ecological thinking potentially more effective for addressing the complex entanglements of the Anthropocene. Whether dark ecology represents sophisticated philosophical advancement or dangerous relativism that undermines environmental protection remains fiercely contested. But its provocations ensure that we can no longer take for granted what exactly we're trying to save when we talk about saving the environment. Radical animal rights. A pig in a factory farm experiences pain just as intensely as a human child. A laboratory monkey feels fear with the same neurological systems you do. Billions of sentient beings suffer and die each year for human benefit. If we truly believe it's wrong to cause unnecessary suffering, can we justify any of this? And if we can't, what would taking animal rights seriously actually require of us? Welcome to radical animal rights philosophy, where consistent moral reasoning leads to revolutionary conclusions that challenge the very foundations of human civilization. Animal liberation cannot occur without human liberation, declares philosopher Stephen Best. But human liberation cannot occur without animal liberation. For radical animal rights theorists, these forms of oppression are inseparable, products of the same hierarchical thinking that places certain beings' interests above others based on morally irrelevant characteristics. The philosophy begins with a simple question posed by utilitarian philosopher Peter Singer. If a being suffers, can there be any moral justification for refusing to take that suffering into account? Singer argues that the capacity to suffer, not species membership, should determine moral consideration. This principle of equal consideration of interests doesn't mean treating all beings identically, but it does mean giving equal moral weight to comparable interests, like the interest in avoiding pain, maintaining bodily autonomy, and continuing to live. Conventional animal welfare positions might use this reasoning to advocate for larger cages or more humane slaughter methods. Radical animal rights philosophy takes it much further, arguing that the entire enterprise of using animals for human purposes, for food, clothing, entertainment, experimentation, or labor, represents an unjustifiable form of species-based discrimination comparable to racism or sexism. Philosopher Tom Regan articulated this view through his subject of a life criterion. Any being with beliefs, desires, perception, memory, a sense of future, emotional life, preferences, welfare, and the ability to pursue goals is a subject of a life with inherent value. Value that cannot be sacrificed simply because others might benefit. By this standard, most animals used by humans qualify as subjects of a life deserving fundamental rights, particularly the right not to be treated as property or resources. When we call for equal rights, writes philosopher Gary Francione, we're saying simply that a sentient being has an interest in continuing to live and in not suffering, and we should apply the principle of equal consideration to these interests. The most controversial aspect of radical animal rights philosophy isn't its theoretical foundation, but its practical implications. If we truly granted animals the right not to be used as property, we would need to abolish all animal agriculture, not just factory farming, but any use of animals for food. All animal experimentation, even for potentially life-saving medical research. All use of animals for clothing, entertainment, or sport. Pet breeding, though most advocate caring for existing domesticated animals. For most people, even those concerned about animal welfare, these conclusions seem extreme. But radical animal rights philosophers argue this reaction stems from speciesism, the arbitrary preference for human interests over comparable animal interests, rather than consistent moral reasoning. If you're not a vegan, Francione provocatively states, you're participating directly in animal exploitation. What makes this philosophy particularly challenging is how it positions virtually all humans as direct participants in a moral atrocity. Within this framework, the average person's breakfast of eggs and bacon isn't just unhealthy, it's complicity in violence against beings whose suffering matters morally. The person wearing leather shoes isn't just making a fashion choice, they're walking on the skin of a sentient being killed for human benefit. Some radical animal rights theorists go beyond personal choices to question whether humans have the right to continue altering natural habitats at animals' expense. Deep ecology proponents like philosopher Arne Naess argue that humans have no right to reduce the richness and diversity of non-human life, except to satisfy vital needs. From this perspective, much of modern development, clearing forests for housing, paving wilderness for roads, damming rivers for electricity, represents an unjustifiable violation of other species' rights to exist and flourish. The most militant expressions of radical animal rights philosophy come from movements like the Animal Liberation Front, ALF, and Earth First, which advocate direct action, including illegal activities like releasing captive animals, sabotaging hunting equipment, or damaging property used in animal exploitation. While these groups maintain a commitment to avoiding harm to humans or animals, their willingness to destroy property and disrupt legal businesses has led to their classification as domestic terrorist organizations in some countries. Critics argue that radical animal rights philosophy fundamentally misunderstands the natural order. Predation exists throughout nature, they note, and humans evolved as omnivores. Religious critics add that many traditions explicitly grant humans dominion over animals. Pragmatists question whether human society could function without animal products or animal testing. Some environmentalists argue that sustainable animal agriculture can actually benefit ecosystems, while others note that plant agriculture also kills animals through habitat destruction and pest control. Perhaps most fundamentally, critics question whether moral consideration should really be based solely on the capacity to suffer. Humans, they argue, possess moral agency, abstract reasoning, and cultural development that create meaningful distinctions between human and animal interests. Speciesism, in this view, isn't arbitrary discrimination, but recognition of morally relevant differences. Animal rights philosophers respond that these differences, while real, don't justify denying basic rights to sentient beings. They point out that we already protect humans with severe cognitive disabilities who lack certain capacities we consider typically human. If we wouldn't experiment on or eat humans with cognitive capacities similar to some animals, consistency demands we extend the same protection to those animals. What makes radical animal rights philosophy so provocative is how it uses the moral principles most people already claim to accept: that causing unnecessary suffering is wrong, that the interests of all sentient beings matter morally, and follows them to conclusions that would require revolutionary changes in human society. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. Are we willing to cause immense suffering to other sentient beings for relatively trivial human interests like taste preference or fashion? Is the boundary between human and animal rights based on rational moral distinctions or arbitrary species bias? And if our current treatment of animals is morally indefensible, what responsibility do we have to change not just our personal choices, but our entire civilization's relationship with other species? The animals of the world exist for their own reasons, writes author Alice Walker. They were not made for humans, any more than black people were made for whites, or women for men. This perspective doesn't just challenge what's on our plates, it challenges how we conceptualize our place in the natural world. and our moral responsibilities toward the billions of sentient beings with whom we share the planet. Whether embraced or rejected, radical animal rights philosophy forces us to examine assumptions so fundamental to human civilization that we rarely question them at all. Post-growth economics. Economic growth is non-negotiable. This belief unites politicians across the political spectrum, from socialists to conservatives. Growth creates jobs. Growth increases prosperity. Growth lifts people from poverty. Growth finances social programs. Growth pays off debts. Without growth, our economic system collapses. So what could be more controversial than suggesting growth itself is the problem. Welcome to post-growth economics, a radical philosophy proposing that perpetual economic growth on a finite planet isn't just impossible but destructive, and that we must design economic systems that thrive without expanding. When economist Herman Daly first proposed steady-state economics in the 1970s, he was treated as a fringe academic. Today, as climate change accelerates, biodiversity collapses, and resource conflicts intensify, this once radical perspective gains traction even among mainstream economists. Anyone who believes exponential growth can go on forever in a finite world is either a madman or an economist, quipped Daly, challenging the discipline's central dogma. The core argument of post-growth economics is simple but devastating. Infinite growth cannot occur within a finite system. Earth has physical limits to arable land, fresh water, mineral resources, waste absorption capacity, and ecosystem services. Since economic activity requires these physical resources, an economy that must continuously grow will eventually hit planetary boundaries. Post-growth theorists argue we're not approaching these limits. We've already exceeded them. Ecological footprint analysis suggests humanity currently consumes resources and produces waste at a rate requiring 1.7 Earths to sustain. The climate system's capacity to absorb carbon without dangerous warming has been surpassed. Biodiversity loss has reached mass extinction levels. Topsoil depletion, groundwater depletion, and phosphorus cycle disruption threaten agricultural systems. The economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment, not the other way around, observes economist Neva Goodwin. This perspective doesn't just challenge growth, it inverts our entire understanding of economy-environment relationships. What makes post-growth economics truly controversial isn't just its ecological claims, but its direct challenge to capitalism's core operating system. Capitalism requires growth for stability. Without expanding production, businesses can't generate profits to pay interest on debt. Without profits, investment declines. Without investment, employment falls. The entire financial system, from pensions to insurance to banking, presupposes continuous growth. Suggesting we abandon growth thus threatens not just specific policies, but the foundational logic of modern economic organization. Degrowth is not a recession, nor a depression, argues economist Serge Latouche. It is the abandonment of the religion of growth, of the belief that a more equals better. This distinction is crucial. Post-growth economics doesn't advocate economic collapse, but rather a planned, equitable downscaling of production and consumption in wealthy nations while maintaining well-being. This controlled descent, often called degrowth, would gradually reduce economic activity to sustainable levels through shorter work weeks, localized production, durable goods design, wealth redistribution, and replacing GDP with broader well-being measures. Critics immediately object that growth has coincided with unprecedented human prosperity. Life expectancy has doubled, extreme poverty has plummeted, literacy has soared. Aren't post-growth advocates asking us to sacrifice progress? The counter-argument is subtle but powerful. Early phases of industrialization genuinely improved well-being, but we've reached diminishing returns. In wealthy nations, GDP growth no longer correlates strongly with happiness, health, or life satisfaction. Meanwhile, growth's environmental costs accumulate, threatening to undermine the very prosperity growth initially created. The problem isn't that growth failed, explains ecological economist Tim Jackson, but that it succeeded too well, taking us beyond what Earth can sustain. Post-growth economics faces its strongest criticism when addressing global inequality. If wealthy nations stop growing, how will developing countries escape poverty? Degrowth advocates respond with several arguments. First, they distinguish between countries needing greater material prosperity and those with excessive consumption. Second, they argue that wealthy nations' growth often comes at developing nations' expense through resource extraction and pollution externalization. Third, they propose massive redistribution, not just within countries but between them, to address inequality while reducing total resource use. Perhaps most controversially, some suggest that Western-style consumer capitalism isn't the only development path, and that other models might better serve human needs without environmental destruction. The philosophy becomes even more radical when addressing population growth. Some post-growth thinkers argue that stabilizing or even gradually reducing global population through voluntary family planning, women's education, and poverty reduction is essential for long-term sustainability. This position, while supported by environmental logic, creates uncomfortable associations with historical population control programs and raises complex questions about reproductive rights and cultural values. Post-growth economics also challenges technological optimism, the belief that innovation will solve resource constraints through efficiency improvements and substitution. While acknowledging technology's importance, degrowth advocates point to the Jevons paradox, where efficiency gains are typically offset by increased consumption. They also question whether renewable energy can support current consumption levels, especially considering the materials required for transition. The greatest shortcoming of the human race, observes environmental scientist Donella Meadows, is our inability to understand the exponential function. Small annual growth rates compound to massive increases over time, requiring ever more resources and producing ever more waste. The political feasibility of voluntarily abandoning growth represents perhaps the most significant challenge. Modern political systems depend on growth to maintain social peace. Politicians promise growth to avoid difficult distributional conflicts. Businesses require growth for profitability. Consumers expect growing material prosperity. Religious and cultural narratives often equate growth with progress. Suggesting we deliberately constrain economic expansion thus seems politically suicidal, even as continuing growth appears ecologically impossible. This tension creates what sociologist Ulrich Beck calls the double bind of modern society. Economic systems require growth for stability, while ecological systems require stability, non-growth for sustainability. The most thoughtful post-growth thinkers acknowledge these dilemmas without pretending to have perfect solutions. They argue that managed descent is preferable to chaotic collapse, which becomes increasingly likely as we approach or exceed planetary boundaries. They advocate experimental approaches, from universal basic income to work sharing to community currencies, that might facilitate transitions to sustainable economies. We cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them, suggests ecological economist Kate Raworth, whose donut economics model envisions an economy that meets everyone's needs without exceeding Earth's carrying capacity. Post-growth economics ultimately forces us to confront profound questions about what economies are for. If the purpose of economic activity is human well-being, rather than accumulation for its own sake, might we design systems that maximize well-being while respecting ecological limits? What kinds of prosperity don't require endless material throughput? Can we find satisfaction in connection, creativity, and community rather than consumption? The philosophy doesn't just challenge how we organize production and consumption, it questions our definition of the good life itself. Whether post-growth economics represents dangerous regression or necessary adaptation depends on your perspective. But as planetary boundaries tighten around our expanding economic system, this once fringe philosophy increasingly resembles prophecy rather than heresy. Nihilistic Postmodernism. Truth doesn't exist. Morality is arbitrary. Knowledge is impossible. Meaning is an illusion. Progress is a myth. Everything you believe, every value you hold, every institution you trust, all are merely social constructs, language games, narratives of power with no foundation in reality. Welcome to Nihilistic Postmodernism, perhaps the most corrosive philosophical acid ever created, a worldview that dissolves every certainty and leaves nothing solid in its place. While academic postmodernists often deny embracing nihilism, their critics argue that by systematically attacking all foundations of knowledge and value, postmodern thought inevitably slides into a nihilism that undermines the very possibility of meaningful discourse. There is no outside text, declared Jacques Derrida, one of postmodernism's founding figures. This seemingly abstract claim becomes radical when fully understood. There is no access to reality except through language, and language itself is an unstable system of differences with no fixed meaning. We are trapped in stories about reality, never touching reality itself. French philosopher Jean-François Lyotard defined postmodernism as incredulity toward meta-narratives, skepticism toward any grand explanatory system claiming to describe reality or human progress. Science, religion, Marxism, liberal democracy, humanism, all are stories we tell ourselves, not objective truths. These narratives don't describe the world. They construct it according to hidden power interests. Michel Foucault, another postmodern pioneer, argued that knowledge and power are inseparable. What counts as truth in any era is determined not by correspondence to reality, but by power structures that privilege certain voices while silencing others. There is no objective position from which to judge competing claims, only different perspectives embedded in different power relations. When these ideas are pushed to their logical conclusion, critics argue, they collapse into nihilism, the belief that nothing has inherent meaning, value, or truth. If all knowledge claims are merely power plays, if no perspective has privileged access to reality, if language never truly captures the world, then what basis remains for any belief? What ground exists for moral judgments? What purpose for political engagement? Postmodernism is nihilistic not because it prefers nothingness to beings, but because it can give us no way to choose among the proliferating interpretations it generates, observes philosopher Charles Taylor. Once every foundation is undermined, no criteria remain for evaluating competing claims. All collapses into relativism, where contradiction becomes not a flaw, but a feature. The controversial implications extend far beyond abstract philosophy. In politics, nihilistic postmodernism can undermine the very concept of justice. If all moral systems are merely cultural constructs reflecting power interests, on what basis can we condemn anything? The Nazi and the humanitarian, the torturer and the healer, all operate from constructed moral frameworks with no objective basis for choosing between them. In science and medicine, radical skepticism about objective knowledge threatens shared standards of evidence and rationality. If scientific facts are merely another form of fiction, narratives constructed by those with institutional power, then anti-vaxxers, climate change deniers, and evidence-based researchers all produce equally valid truths. The distinction between fact and opinion dissolves. In education, postmodern nihilism challenges the very purpose of learning. If knowledge is merely power dressed in academic robes, why privilege any particular content? If objective standards don't exist, how evaluate student performance? If truth is perspectival, why correct falsehood? Education becomes not transmission of knowledge but exposure to competing narratives without criteria for choosing among them. Jordan Peterson, clinical psychologist and fierce critic of postmodernism, argues, the postmodernists completely reject the structure of Western civilization. They don't see it as progress, they see it as a power game, and they use that as their rationale for deconstructing the culture. Defenders of postmodernism respond that these criticisms mischaracterize their position. Skepticism toward absolute truth claims doesn't necessarily mean rejecting all distinctions between better and worse beliefs. Recognizing the social construction of knowledge doesn't preclude practical standards for evaluating claims. Acknowledging multiple perspectives doesn't require treating all as equally valid. Richard Rorty, a pragmatist influenced by postmodernism, argued that abandoning the search for absolute foundations doesn't mean abandoning all standards. We can maintain solidarity, shared commitments to democratic values and human flourishing, without claiming these rest on transcendent truths. We choose our values not because they correspond to reality, but because they create the kind of society we wish to live in. Yet critics remain unconvinced by these qualifications. Once the postmodern critique demolishes all foundations, they argue, no internal resources remain to construct anything in their place. If all values are arbitrary social constructs, why prefer democracy to tyranny? If all narratives are power plays, why privilege compassion over cruelty? Nihilism becomes not just a theoretical possibility, but a practical consequence. The intellectual history of nihilistic postmodernism reveals its roots in legitimate philosophical problems. The Enlightenment promised access to objective reality through reason, but successive philosophical movements, from Romanticism to existentialism to phenomenology, identified limitations in this project. Postmodernism represents the most radical response to these limitations, not merely qualifying the Enlightenment's ambitions, but abandoning them entirely. What makes this philosophical position particularly controversial today is how it has migrated from academic theory into broader culture, often in simplified forms. Identity politics, fake news discourse, conspiracy theories, and social media echo chambers all exhibit postmodern elements. Skepticism toward established authority, emphasis on perspective over objectivity, and the reduction of disagreements to power dynamics rather than truth claims. Critics from both left and right find this development alarming. Left-leaning thinkers like Noam Chomsky worry that postmodern nihilism undermines the rational foundations needed for meaningful political critique. Right-leaning thinkers like Roger Scruton see it destroying the cultural inheritance that gives society coherence and continuity. Both fear a world where truth no longer matters, where discourse becomes impossible, and where power alone determines what counts as reality. Perhaps most disturbing is how nihilistic postmodernism potentially undermines its own position. If all claims are merely power moves with no truth value, this applies to postmodernism itself. If all narratives are equally constructed, why privilege the postmodern narrative? If meaning is impossible, how can postmodernism's claims be meaningful? The philosophy consumes itself in logical contradiction. Yet even its fiercest critics acknowledge that postmodernism identified real problems in how we construct knowledge and justify values. The challenge is finding a path between naive realism that ignores perspective and context and radical nihilism that abandons the possibility of truth and meaning altogether. Some philosophers suggest a post-postmodernism that incorporates postmodern insights while recovering ground for shared values and rational discourse. Whether you view nihilistic postmodernism as dangerous intellectual poison or necessary critical medicine depends largely on what you believe is at stake. If you value tradition, cultural continuity, and shared moral frameworks, postmodernism appears as an acid that dissolves social bonds. If you're concerned with how power shapes knowledge and silences marginalized perspectives, postmodernism offers valuable critical tools. What cannot be denied is postmodernism's profound influence on contemporary thought and culture. Its radical questioning of foundations has forever changed how we think about knowledge, power, and truth, for better or worse. The philosophy that set out to deconstruct all narratives has become one of the most powerful narratives of our time. Eco-fascism. What happens when concern for the environment merges with xenophobia, racism, and authoritarian politics? The result is eco-fascism, perhaps the most dangerous mutation of environmental thought, a philosophy that combines legitimate ecological concerns with the darkest elements of far-right ideology. Imagine environmentalism stripped of its humanitarian values and infused with nationalism, racial hierarchy, and population control fantasies. A worldview where saving the planet becomes justification for eliminating human rights and targeting vulnerable populations. Eco-fascism stands as a stark warning that even seemingly benevolent causes like environmental protection can be warped into vehicles for hatred when divorced from commitments to human equality and dignity. It represents the disturbing intersection where genuine planetary concerns meet authoritarian impulses, where blood and soil, nationalism adopts green camouflage. The core premise of eco-fascism is deceptively simple. Environmental collapse demands radical solutions that liberal democracy cannot deliver. Overpopulation, resource depletion, and climate change require drastic, immediate action, unconstrained by individual rights or democratic processes. But unlike mainstream environmental movements, eco-fascists add a sinister twist. The problems aren't caused equally by all humans, but primarily by certain racial or cultural groups. And the solutions aren't found in global cooperation, but in protecting ethno-states while letting less valuable populations suffer nature's consequences. While contemporary eco-fascism has flourished online, its roots reach back to Nazi Germany, where the Third Reich combined environmental protection with racial pseudoscience. The Nazi slogan, "Blood and Soil," Blut und Boden, expressed the supposed mystical connection between a race and its native territory. Hitler's regime created the world's first nature preserves, while simultaneously developing genocide as policy. This dual commitment wasn't contradictory in Nazi ideology, but complementary. Purifying the homeland of foreign elements was seen as part of restoring natural order. After World War II, these ideas went underground, emerging occasionally in neo-Nazi movements, but largely remaining fringe. The environmental movement that blossomed in the 1960s and 70s generally aligned with progressive politics, focusing on corporate pollution and advocating for environmental justice across race and class lines. But a darker strain persisted within some environmental thinking, particularly around population control and immigration. The philosopher most cited by contemporary eco-fascists is Pentti Linkola, a Finnish deep ecologist who advocated for radical population reduction and authoritarian measures to prevent ecological collapse. Linkola's writings proposed that most humans should perish for the planet to recover, that democracy was incapable of addressing environmental crisis, and that a form of eco-dictatorship was necessary. "Who misses all those who died in World War II?" he infamously asked, suggesting that mass death could be beneficial for the ecosystem. The contemporary resurgence of eco-fascism has coincided with growing climate anxiety and online radicalization. The 2019 Christchurch mosque shooter explicitly identified as an ethno-nationalist eco-fascist, citing environmental degradation as motivation for his attack on Muslims. The El Paso Walmart shooter similarly combined environmental concerns with anti-immigrant hatred in his manifesto. Both perpetrators saw their acts of mass violence not just as attacks on hated groups, but as necessary steps toward ecological salvation. Modern eco-fascism thrives in internet subcultures where environmental collapse narratives merge with white supremacist replacement theory. In these online spaces, climate change isn't presented as a global humanitarian crisis requiring cooperation, but as justification for closing borders and preserving resources for privileged populations. Immigration becomes cast not just as a cultural threat, but an environmental one, with migrants portrayed as bringing ecological destruction with them. What makes eco-fascism particularly insidious is how it distorts legitimate environmental concerns. Climate change is real. Biodiversity loss is accelerating. Resource depletion threatens future generations. But eco-fascism hijacks these valid concerns to advance authoritarian, xenophobic agendas. It's a philosophy custom-built for an age of ecological anxiety, offering simple villains and violent solutions to complex global problems. The movement's aesthetic often combines traditional fascist imagery with natural elements. Pine trees, mountains, and runic symbols appear alongside calls for ethnic purity and population control. This green nationalism presents itself as merely protecting natural heritage, obscuring its underlying dehumanization of targeted groups. The slogan, "Save trees, not refugees," encapsulates this cruel prioritization. Most disturbing is eco-fascism's potential appeal beyond traditional far-right circles. As climate anxiety grows, the philosophy attempts to recruit from mainstream environmental movements by presenting itself as the only ideology willing to take sufficiently radical action. It targets disillusioned environmentalists frustrated by political inaction, offering a seductive narrative. Democracy has failed to address the crisis, so perhaps democracy itself is the problem. The movement exploits philosophical tensions within environmental thought itself. Deep ecology's belief in biocentrism, valuing all life equally, can, if divorced from human rights commitments, lead to viewing humans as a plague upon the earth. Concerns about carrying capacity and resource limits can, without equity considerations, justify letting vulnerable populations perish. The desire for harmony with nature can mutate into mystical blood and soil nationalism that excludes foreign elements. This doesn't mean environmentalism itself leads to fascism, quite the opposite. Mainstream environmental movements explicitly reject authoritarianism and racism, focusing on just transitions that protect vulnerable communities. But eco-fascism serves as a warning about what happens when environmental concerns are separated from commitments to human equality and justice. The philosophical contradictions within eco-fascism are numerous. It selectively applies environmental concerns, ignoring how ethnostates and authoritarian regimes typically accelerate environmental destruction. It claims to value natural hierarchies while imposing artificial racial categories. Most fundamentally, it fails to recognize that environmental problems are global, requiring international cooperation rather than nationalist isolation. Yet these contradictions haven't prevented eco-fascism from gaining traction in an era of climate anxiety and political polarization. The movement has proven particularly effective at recruiting young men through memes and online radicalization, presenting mass violence as necessary environmental action rather than hatred-driven terrorism. As climate impacts worsen globally, the potential appeal of eco-fascist thinking may grow. When democratic governments appear paralyzed in the face of ecological crisis, authoritarian solutions can seem tempting. When climate refugees increase in number, xenophobic barriers may be reframed as environmental necessity. The philosophy offers a guilt-free way for privileged populations to abandon global responsibilities. Ecological collapse isn't something to prevent for everyone, but something to survive at others' expense. The antidote to eco-fascism isn't abandoning environmental concern, but strengthening its connection to human rights and justice. Genuine environmental movements recognize that ecological and human well-being are inseparable, that sustainable futures must be equitable ones. They acknowledge that those least responsible for environmental crises often suffer first and worst from their effects. Eco-fascism ultimately reveals that environmental politics divorced from humanitarian values becomes not just misguided, but monstrous. It demonstrates how planetary concern, when separated from concern for all people who inhabit the planet, can justify the worst impulses of human tribalism. In an age of mounting ecological crisis, recognizing and rejecting this dangerous philosophy becomes increasingly urgent, not just to protect vulnerable communities, but to preserve environmentalism itself from its darkest possible mutation. World Federalism. 2029. A terrorist organization detonates a nuclear device in a major city. Millions die. The survivors face radiation sickness and environmental catastrophe. 2031. A synthetic virus designed in an unregulated lab escapes containment. With no coordinated global response, it spreads across continents. The death toll reaches hundreds of millions. 2035. Climate disasters escalate beyond control. Coastal cities drown. Breadbaskets become deserts. Nations fight over dwindling resources. Refugee crises overwhelm borders. These scenarios aren't inevitable, but they're entirely possible under our current system of competing nation-states, each prioritizing short-term national interest over human survival. Our global challenges demand global solutions, yet we cling to a political structure designed for the 17th century. Enter World Federalism, one of the most controversial yet potentially necessary political philosophies of our time. Its premise is radical yet simple. National sovereignty is obsolete. Humanity needs a democratic world government with real power, the authority to disarm nations, regulate dangerous technologies, enforce environmental standards, and ensure basic rights for all humans regardless of birthplace. Either we end national sovereignty as we know it, or we face extinction, argues world federalist philosopher Daniele Archibughi. There is no third option. World federalism's roots trace back to Immanuel Kant's 1795 essay, Perpetual Peace, which proposed a voluntary federation of free states as the only path to ending war. After World War I, thinkers like H.G. Wells advocated a world state to prevent future conflicts. Following the horrors of World War II and the development of nuclear weapons, the movement gained momentum. Albert Einstein, Bertrand Russell, and other prominent intellectuals argued that only global government could prevent humanity's self-destruction. The United Nations was supposed to be a step in this direction, but lacking independent enforcement mechanisms or democratic accountability, it remains a forum for debate rather than an effective global authority. When powerful nations disagree, as in Syria, Ukraine, or the South China Sea, the international system breaks down into power politics. World federalists argue we can do better, that we must do better, by creating a genuine constitutional democracy at the global level. Picture this: a world parliament elected directly by people, not appointed by governments. A world constitution protecting universal rights. A world court whose decisions are binding on all nations. A world police force strong enough that countries no longer need militaries for self-defense. To traditional patriots and nationalists, this vision is horrifying. A dystopian global tyranny threatening national identity and self-determination. To those concerned about Western imperialism, it looks suspiciously like imposing liberal values on non-liberal societies. To realists in international relations, it's dangerously naive about power dynamics. World government would be the greatest tyranny in human history, argues conservative philosopher Roger Scruton. There would be nowhere to flee from its power, no competing system to hold it accountable. These objections deserve serious consideration. History shows that power centralizes and corrupts. A world government gone wrong could become a global dictatorship with unprecedented ability to suppress dissent. Without competing nations, who would check its power? World federalists counter that their vision isn't a centralized leviathan, but a carefully limited federation, addressing only genuinely global issues like weapons of mass destruction, climate change, and pandemics while leaving most governance to local and national levels. They point to successful federations like the United States, which balances national and state authority, as proof the model can work. The question isn't whether we want a world government, argues political scientist Alexander Wendt. The question is whether we want a good, democratic world government or a bad imperial one that emerges through conquest. This statement reveals the most provocative aspect of world federalist thought, the belief that global political integration isn't optional, but inevitable. As technology creates weapons of increasing destructiveness, economic systems grow more interconnected, and environmental crises transcend borders, some form of global authority will emerge, either through democratic design or through crisis and coercion. Consider this thought experiment. If an asteroid were heading toward Earth, would we want 195 separate national responses or a coordinated global effort? The answer seems obvious, yet we approach climate change, a slower but equally existential threat, with fragmented national policies. The Paris Agreement, lacking enforcement mechanisms, relies on voluntary commitments frequently undermined by domestic politics. Or consider autonomous weapons and bioengineering. As these technologies become cheaper and more accessible, the risk of catastrophe from rogue actors increases exponentially. Without global regulation with real teeth, humanity plays Russian roulette with ever more destructive technologies. World federalism's most compelling case involves what philosophers call the collective action problem. When individual rational behavior leads to collective disaster, only binding authority can align individual and collective interests. Climate change exemplifies this perfectly. Each nation has incentives to free ride on others' sacrifices. Without enforcement mechanisms, cooperation breaks down even when everyone recognizes the common threat. National sovereignty isn't freedom, argues world federalist Strobe Talbot. It's the freedom to destroy ourselves. But implementation questions abound. How would representation work in a world parliament? Would China and India dominate through population? Would global South nations accept institutions designed by Western powers? Could liberal and illiberal societies share a constitutional framework? How would a world federation disarm nuclear powers without triggering the very conflicts it seeks to prevent? World federalists offer various models to address these concerns. Some propose weighted voting systems balancing population with other factors. Others suggest phased implementation, beginning with regional federations like an enhanced European Union. Most acknowledge that cultural and political differences require a minimalist world constitution focused on preventing catastrophic risks rather than imposing uniform values. We don't need global government for everything, clarifies philosopher Thomas Pogge. We need it precisely where national governments fail, managing global commons, preventing international conflict, and protecting basic rights regardless of citizenship. This more limited vision still faces formidable obstacles. Authoritarians like Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping would resist constraints on their power. American exceptionalists would reject external authority over U.S. policy. Religious fundamentalists would fear secular global governance. Corporations benefiting from regulatory differences between nations would lobby against standardization. Given these obstacles, is world federalism merely utopian fantasy? Its advocates point to historical precedents of political integration previously thought impossible. The United States began as 13 jealously independent colonies. Europe's nations fought for centuries before forming the European Union. The seemingly permanent Cold War ended surprisingly quickly. Political systems can transform rapidly when necessity aligns with opportunity. World federalists bet that growing awareness of global existential risks will eventually overcome nationalist resistance, perhaps following a catastrophe that reveals the fatal flaws in our current system. The question isn't whether world federation is realistic, argues world federalist Joseph Preston Barada. The question is whether continuing with the sovereign state system is realistic given the challenges we face. Critics from the left raise different concerns, that world federalism might entrench existing power structures globally. Would a world government dominated by current great powers and corporate interests simply globalize injustice? This critique has merit, but world federalists counter that democratic global institutions could actually constrain currently unaccountable global forces like multinational corporations, which exploit the gaps between national regulatory systems. Perhaps the most interesting development in world federalist thought comes from cosmopolitan democracy theorists who reimagine global governance not as a single world state, but as overlapping authorities addressing different issues at appropriate levels: local, national, regional, and global. This polycentric approach might prove more resilient and adaptable than traditional federalism. The debate about world federalism ultimately transcends left-right politics, revealing deeper questions about human identity and governance. Are we primarily citizens of nations or of the world? Can democratic governance scale globally without losing accountability? Is sovereignty an absolute value or a means to human flourishing that might be reconceived? As climate tipping points approach, AI advances rapidly, and bioweapons become more accessible, these philosophical questions take on urgent practical significance. World federalism may be controversial, utopian, even dangerous, but dismissing it entirely means accepting existential risks that grow with each technological advance. Egoism. What if I told you that every moral principle you hold dear, every social institution you respect, and every abstract concept you believe in, from justice to humanity to society itself, is nothing but a spook? A phantom that exists only in your mind, yet somehow controls your life? Welcome to egoism, specifically the radical individualist philosophy of Max Stirner that declares war on all abstractions that claim authority over the individual self. In the philosophical landscape of the 19th century, as Hegel's idealism, Marx's communism, and liberal democracy competed for supremacy, a German philosopher named Johann Caspar Schmidt, writing under the pseudonym Max Stirner, published a book that attacked them all. The Ego and Its Own, 1844, remains perhaps the most radical philosophical text of the modern era, a work that rejects not just specific ideologies but the very concept of ideology itself. Stirner's central argument is deceptively simple, yet profoundly unsettling. Nothing exists beyond the concrete individual. All conceptual entities that claim to stand above individual existence, God, state, humanity, morality, justice, rights, are merely spooks or ghosts, gespenster, haunting the mind. These phantoms have no reality yet dominate our lives, commanding obedience to their supposed authority. True freedom, Stirner argued, comes only when the individual recognizes these ghosts for what they are and exorcises them from the mind. I am nothing in the sense of emptiness, wrote Stirner, but I am the creative nothing, the nothing out of which I myself as creator create everything. This radical declaration of self-ownership rejects all external claims on the individual, whether from religious doctrine, state authority, or even the supposedly liberating ideologies of his time. Stirner saw the progressive causes of his era, liberalism, humanism, socialism, not as paths to freedom, but as new forms of subjugation, replacing the authority of God and King with equally fictional authorities like mankind or society. What makes Stirner's philosophy so controversial is not just its rejection of authority, but its ruthless consistency. Unlike most philosophical rebels who replace one system with another, Stirner attacks the very foundation of systematic thought. He doesn't propose a better morality, but questions whether morality itself is anything more than imagination imposed upon reality. He doesn't demand better rights from the state, but asks why we believe in rights at all. Abstract concepts with no existence outside human imagination. The concept central to Stirner's philosophy is what he calls the unique one, der Einzige, the irreducible individual who exists prior to all conceptual categories. This isn't the rational individual of liberalism or the species being of Marx, but something more primal, the concrete self that experiences desire, power, and ownership directly. I am my own only when I am master of myself, Stirner declared, instead of being mastered either by sensuality or by anything else. The unique one recognizes no authority higher than their own desires and interests. For Stirner, true egoism means rejecting not just external constraints, but also internalized ones, the ways we limit ourselves by accepting conceptual authorities. When we say, I should do this because it's moral, or I must respect that because it's sacred, we're allowing spooks to determine our actions. The egoist asks instead, what's in it for me? Does this serve my interests? Nothing is inherently deserving of respect, not law, not custom, not even the needs of others, except insofar as the individual chooses to value it. This philosophy proved shocking even to radical thinkers of Stirner's time. Marx and Engels dedicated hundreds of pages in The German Ideology to attacking Stirner, recognizing his challenge to their own conceptual framework. Anarchists were simultaneously attracted to and troubled by his rejection of moral foundations for revolution. Religious and conservative thinkers saw him as the ultimate nihilist threat, reducing all meaning to individual whim. What makes Stirner's egoism particularly controversial is its implications for social relationships. If all obligations to others are spooks, what prevents the egoist from exploiting, harming, or dominating others when advantageous? Stirner's answer is pragmatic rather than moral. Egoists recognize other egoists as potential allies or threats based on mutual self-interest. He envisions what he calls a union of egoists, temporary associations where individuals cooperate for mutual advantage without creating binding institutions or moral obligations. Critics from across the political spectrum find this vision disturbing. Leftists argue it glorifies the predatory individualism of capitalism, while undermining solidarity needed for resistance. Conservatives see it attacking the moral fabric essential for functional society. Religious thinkers view it as spiritual rebellion against divine order. Even fellow anarchists often reject Stirner's amoralism, preferring to ground their opposition to authority in natural rights or human dignity, concepts Stirner would dismiss as mere spooks. Yet Stirner's philosophy has experienced multiple revivals, influencing figures from Friedrich Nietzsche to anarchist insurrectionists to postmodern thinkers. His critique of fixed ideas and abstract authority resonates whenever established systems of meaning falter. In the early 20th century, individualist anarchists and artists drew on his work to challenge social conformity. The countercultural movements of the 1960s found in Stirner a philosophical basis for rejecting conventional morality. More recently, post-left anarchists have revived Stirnerian egoism as an alternative to what they see as the dogmatic moralizing of traditional leftist politics. The digital age has produced a new wave of interest in Stirner's ideas. Online communities celebrate the concept of spooks as a way to critique ideological thinking across the political spectrum. Memes featuring Stirner's distinctive portrait with phrases like, "That's a spook," spread across social media, applying his critique to everything from nationalism to gender norms to economic theories. This ironic presentation masks something more serious, a growing suspicion of all grand narratives and universal claims in a fragmented post-truth information environment. What would a world of consistent egoists look like? Stirner's critics envision a Hobbesian nightmare of conflict and exploitation. Without moral restraint or social obligation, what prevents the strong from dominating the weak? Why shouldn't the egoist steal, cheat, or harm others when advantageous? Stirner's defenders counter that genuine self-interest differs from short-sighted predation. The intelligent egoist recognizes the benefits of cooperation, reputation, and exchange over crude domination, not from moral duty, but from calculated self-interest. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Stirner's philosophy is how it anticipates features of our current social condition. In a consumer culture where personal desire and satisfaction are paramount, where traditional moral frameworks have weakened, and where individual identity is increasingly self-constructed, are we already living in Stirner's world? Has the unique one triumphed not through philosophical argument, but through the logic of late capitalism and digital identity? Stirner himself might observe that we've merely replaced old spooks with new ones. We've rejected traditional moral authorities only to create new absolutes, whether authenticity, self-care, or various forms of identity and political allegiance. The individual remains haunted, now by different ghosts. True egoism remains radical precisely because it recognizes no stopping point, no sacred principle, no final authority beyond the self and its desires. Whether viewed as liberating truth or dangerous nihilism, Stirner's egoism forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the foundations of our values and social arrangements. If all meaning is human creation rather than discovery, what gives any principle authority beyond our choice to accept it? If society itself is a conceptual construct, what obligations do we truly have to it? And if the self alone is real, what prevents unlimited self-assertion except other competing selves? In a world where traditional sources of meaning and authority increasingly lose their hold, Stirner's declaration remains both promise and warning. All things are nothing to me.